Out here, a man can see for 30 miles. People think that is a comfort. It is the opposite, because on the night I am going to tell you about, I watched a thing pace my truck across open desert for 9 miles. First in my headlights, then off to the side, then in my mirrors. Running, upright, keeping even with me on a washboard dirt road, while my speedometer sat at 50, across flat, empty country where there was nowhere it could have come from, and nowhere on this earth it could hide. That is the part the postcards do not tell you about the desert. In the forest, the thing is on you before you know it. Out here, you see it coming for a long, long time. You watch it close the distance under a sky full of stars, and there is not one thing you can do but keep both hands on the wheel and pray the engine does not quit. I am a ranger in the high desert of northern Arizona. I have given 14 years to that country and I love it like nothing else. But there is a road out past the mesas that I will not drive after the sun goes down, not for any reason, and by the end of this you are going to understand why. Let me handle the small business quick, because this is not a story I like to sit inside of any longer than I have to. If you want to ride along on the next one, subscribe to the channel and switch on that notification bell, so you are in the truck with me the next time I take a call I should have passed on. And tapping that like button does more than you would guess. It is the quiet thing that decides whether an account like this one ever crosses the desert to the next person who needs to hear it. And do me one kindness in the comments. Put down where you are tonight, your town and your country, and the hour your clock shows as you listen. I like knowing how far a story travels under one night sky, and how many of us are sitting up in the quiet together while everyone else sleeps easy. That is all of it. Now climb in, and pull your door shut. Because we have got some country to cross before this gets bad. You have to understand the high desert before any of this will land right. Because it is nothing like the desert people picture. And it is nothing like the forests where the rest of these things happen, and the rules out here are its own. This is not the desert of tall green cactus and sand dunes. This is high country, 4,000 and 5,000 feet up. A vast tableland of red and gray earth broken by flat-topped mesas and cut by sandy washes that run a few times a year and lie bone dry the rest. It grows juniper and piñon pine, low and twisted and silver sage and not much else, spaced wide apart so that you can see across the land for miles and miles. To the next mesa, to the blue ghost of mountains a day's drive off. By day in summer it is an oven, 110 in the shade if there were any shade. And the heat shimmers up off the ground and makes the distance swim, and at night it drops cold, cold enough to kill a stranded man even in July. And the sky comes out so thick with stars that the band of the Milky Way throws a shadow, and the country goes silver and still and enormous and silent in a way that has to be felt to be understood. My name is Holt. I have worked this desert district for 14 years. A huge spread of federal land, monument and wilderness, and the dirt road country between. Out past the last paved road and the last power line, where almost nobody goes. I grew up in the Southwest, in a town that does not matter to this, and after some hard years in places with too many people, I came out to the emptiest country I could find work in, and the bigness of it suited me, and I stayed. The job is mostly solitude and distance. I patrol the dirt roads and the washes in a truck. I check on the few backcountry permits. I watch for people who take more from the land than the law allows. I keep an eye on the scatter of old ranches and the handful of stubborn folks who still live out past the pavement. And when somebody does not come back from the desert, I am one of the few who can go look. Because most people get lost out here just trying to find the people who are lost. Search and rescue in this country is a race against the heat and the cold and the size of the land. A person off their route out here, with no water, in that sun, has hours, not days. We find most of them, the honest cases, by the simple, cruel arithmetic of the desert. They walk for water that is not there, and they go down in a wash or under a juniper, and we find them, or the buzzards show us where. I had made my peace with that kind of loss the way you do. The desert kills clean, and it kills honest, most of the time. Most of the time. There was a stretch of country out past the far mesas, along a particular dirt road, where the losses did not feel clean or honest, where people went out and were never found at all, not a body, not a pack, not a track, and where the few folks who lived nearest that road would not talk about it, and that not talking was the loudest thing in this whole story. and I was too slow to hear it. The nearest thing to a town in my district was a single gas station and trading post out at the highway junction, the last fuel for 90 miles in any direction, run by a man named Raymond Yazzie. Raymond was Diné, Navajo, and his family had been in that country since long before there was a road or a flag or a ranger, and he was a calm, decent, careful man who knew that desert in a way I never would. We were friendly across the years, in the way of two men who were the only two for 100 miles. I tell you about Raymond because of the way he went quiet, the one time the subject came near him, and because that quiet was a warning I should have weighed and did not. In the middle of one June, a man went missing out past the far mesas. His name was Gil Brantley, a contract worker, mid-40s, out doing survey work on the federal land, driving the back roads alone in a government truck, checking markers. He was supposed to check in by radio every evening. One evening he did not. His truck was found the next day by another worker, parked on the shoulder of that far dirt road, out past the mesas, doors shut, keys in it, his water and his hat and his gear all still inside, and Gil Brantley gone, with no track leading away that anyone could find, into open country where a man cannot hide and cannot walk far and cannot vanish. And it fell to me, because it was my district, to go out to that road and find out what had happened to him. The evening before I drove out, I stopped at Raymond Yazzie's for fuel and to tell him where I was headed, the way you do out there, so somebody knows. I told him a survey man had gone missing on the far road past the mesas, and that I was going out in the morning to work it. Raymond was filling my cans, and when I said which road, his hands went still on the pump. Just for a second. Then he finished, and he capped the cans, and he did not look at me the way he usually did. He said, "Quiet. You go out there in the morning. You do your looking in the daylight, and you be back on this highway before the sun is down." I asked him why. Raymond Yazzie looked at me then, a long, steady look, and he said, "Because there are things out on that road that are not my business to talk about, and not yours to go looking for. And the only thing I will tell you, because I would tell any man, is that whatever you find out there, you do not let the night catch you on that road. You hear me, Holt, be off it by sundown," and that was all. He would not say one word more. I tried, gently, the way you do, and he simply changed the subject and rang up my fuel. And I have known a lot of men go quiet in my life, but I never saw a man close a door inside himself the way Raymond Yazzie closed one that evening. And I drove home with his quiet sitting on me heavier than any words could have. I want to be honest. I did not heed it the way I should have. I told myself Raymond was a careful man, that the old families out here carried old beliefs, that there were things they did not discuss out of respect and superstition both, and that none of that changed the fact that a man was missing on my ground. So at first light I loaded my truck with extra water and fuel, and I drove out past the mesas, alone, onto that far road, to find Gil Brantley. And I told myself I would be off it by sundown, and I almost was. Almost. It is a long drive out to that country. 2 hours of dirt road past the last ranch, the mesas standing up red and flat against a hard blue sky, the heat already building by mid-morning, the land getting emptier and stiller the farther out I went, until there was nothing but the road, and the sage, and the wide silver silence. And the only moving thing in all that country was my own dust trail hanging behind me in the still air. I found Gil Brantley's truck where it had been left, on the shoulder of the road out past the farthest mesa. It had been towed nowhere because there was nowhere to tow it to. The county had photographed it and left it. I went over it, and it told the same wrong story everyone had said it told. Doors shut, keys in the ignition, his full water jug on the seat, his hat, his clipboard, his lunch, everything a man needs and would never walk off into that country without. And Gil Brantley simply gone, out of a truck stopped in the middle of open desert, with no sign of why he had stopped and no track of where he had gone. I cast for sign all around it, in widening circles, for the better part of an hour, and that is when the first thing came that I could not explain. And I am a good tracker, and I have read that ground my whole career. There were tracks near the truck, off the shoulder, in the soft sand of the borrow ditch. They were canine, like a big coyote or a dog, except there are no dogs out there, and these were too big for any coyote that has ever lived, and that was not even the part that stopped me. The part that stopped me was that the tracks changed. For a stretch they ran on 4 feet, a loping canine gait, and then, in the space of 2 or 3 strides, they rose up and ran on two long hind feet, the prints deeper, the stride lengthening, the toes splaying, and they ran upright away from the truck, out across the open desert, in a straight line, toward the far wash. And I crouched over the place where 4 legs became 2, and I felt the bottom drop out of everything I thought I knew about that country. A coyote does not stand up. Nothing out there stands up and runs on 2 legs across the open ground. But the sand said it had, plain as print, and the sand does not lie any more than the snow does. I followed those upright tracks out across the desert, on foot, away from the road, toward the wash, calling Gil Brantley's name into that enormous silence. And the sun climbed, and the heat came down like a weight, and the tracks ran straight and true for the better part of a mile, and then dropped into the dry wash, and on the hard-packed floor of it were simply gone. The way they had been gone for everyone who looked for Gil Brantley. The way the desert closes over a thing like heat shimmer over the road. I stood in that wash in the hammering sun, and I called his name, and the silence ate it, and I had the first true sense, standing there, that I was not alone. That something in that empty country had its attention on me, a feeling I knew well from 14 years of solitude, and that had never once been wrong. I worked that country the rest of the day and found no more of Gil Brantley. And as the afternoon wore on, I will tell you that I felt watched the entire time. A steady pressure between my shoulder blades. And more than once, far off across the open desert, at the limit of sight, I thought I saw something standing on the rim of the wash or the shoulder of a low rise, upright, still, watching me. And when I turned my glasses on it, there was only sage and a juniper and the shimmer. And I told myself it was the heat and my own nerves. And I did not fully believe it. The light was getting long and gold when I made the decision that I have turned over more nights than I can count. The right call, the one Raymond Yazzie had near begged me to make, was to break off and drive for the highway right then, with daylight and miles to spare, and come back with a county team in the morning. I had found Gil Brantley's tracks. The procedure was satisfied. But I had also found tracks that rose up and ran on 2 legs, and I had a survey man unaccounted for, and there was one more place I wanted to check before I lost the light, an old line shack I knew. A falling down cattle shack a few miles out a sidetrack, the only structure in all that country, the kind of place a hurt or lost man might crawl to for shade. I told myself it would take 20 minutes. I told myself I would still beat the sun to the highway. I drove out the sidetrack to the shack, and I was wrong about the sun, and I was wrong about a great deal more than that. The line shack sat at the foot of a low mesa, gray and sagging, half its roof gone. And the moment I stepped out of the truck, I smelled it. And the smell was the second thing I could not explain. It was rank and animal and wrong, a wet musk like a wet dog and rotten meat and something under it that I have no word for. And it hung in and around that shack in the still evening air with no breeze to carry it. And every part of me that had spent 14 years alone in wild country locked up and said leave. I should have. Instead, I made myself walk to the doorway of that shack and look in, because there was a chance Gil Brantley was in there, and that is the job, and what I saw inside is a thing I have never put in any report and am only telling now. It was not a body. It was worse in a way, because a body I could have understood. The dirt floor of that shack had things arranged on it. Bones, animal bones, coyote and rabbit and the long bones of cattle, laid out in patterns, deliberate, careful, in lines and spirals that no animal makes and no weather makes, and among them, set in with the same terrible care, were a few things that did not belong to any animal. A boot, a wristwatch, its band stiff and dark, a government clipboard, warped and stained, and I did not have to read the name on it to know whose it was. Gil Brantley had been here, or what was left of him had been brought here, and arranged, made part of whatever that floor was, and I stood in that doorway with the rank smell filling my throat, and I understood, all at once and far too late, that Raymond Yazzie had not been superstitious, that he had been trying to keep me alive, and that the sun was now touching the rim of the far mesas, and that I was a long way out a sidetrack on a road no one would drive at night, alone, with the light going. I want to stop us right here, at the worst moment, before I get in that truck and try to drive out. Because once the engine turns over, this does not let up until the highway. So let me say it to you straight. The way I wish someone had said it to me before I ever drove out past those mesas. I can tell this has its hold on you now, that you are out there in that doorway with me in the failing light. And I can tell, because I have done this a while, that you still have not tapped that like button, or left a single word below to mark that you were here in the truck with me tonight. That is the small, safe, costless thing. The wise thing, done from somewhere nothing can reach you. So do it now, the like and a quick word, while the engine is still off and the worst is still ahead. I did not do the small wise thing in time. You can. Then climb in and brace yourself, because here is where the drive begins. I got into my truck and I locked the doors, which I had never once done in 14 years in that country. And my hands were not steady. And I started the engine and I turned around in the yard of that shack and I drove back out the side track toward the main road. And the last of the sun went down behind the mesas, and the long blue dusk came over that desert. And that is when it came out into the open and showed itself, because it was done hiding. I caught the first movement off to my right, out across the open ground, keeping pace with the truck. At first my mind tried to make it a coyote running parallel, the way they sometimes do, and then it rose up, the way the tracks had risen up, and it ran on two legs, upright, out there in the blue dusk, matching my speed across open desert. And I was doing 30 on that washboard track and it was keeping even with me without effort. A tall, lean, wrong shape, low-headed, its arms working, running the way nothing that runs upright should be able to run, smooth and fast and tireless, pacing me across the flat. I reached the main road and I turned onto it toward the highway. 90 miles of dirt between me and the pavement, and I put my foot down. 40, 50, the truck banging and sliding on the washboard, the dust boiling up red in my mirrors in the last light, and the thing came with me. It crossed behind the truck through my own dust and came up on the left, and it was closer now, near enough in the dusk that I could see it was the gray tan of a coyote's coat but stretched over a frame that was all wrong, too long in the limb, the joints bending in ways that turned my stomach, and its head, when it turned it toward the truck as it ran, was a coyote's head and not a coyote's head, the muzzle too short, the eyes too large and too forward, and catching my headlights with a flat shine that no animal's eyes throw. And it looked at me, running 50 miles an hour alongside my truck on a desert road. It looked right in at me through the window with those wrong shining eyes. And I have never in my life known a fear like the fear of being looked at by that thing while it ran. I drove. There was nothing else to do. The land was open for 30 miles in every direction. No town, no house, no other soul, just the one road and the dust and the stars coming out hard overhead, and that thing pacing my truck mile after mile, falling back, surging up, crossing from one side to the other through my dust, hurting me, playing with me, the way the others in these stories were herded and played with, and I understood that it was faster than my truck, that it was letting me drive, that it could end this whenever it chose and was choosing not to, and that understanding was almost worse than dying. It tried the windows. Twice it came in close on the driver's side, and I felt more than heard something rake along the door, a long scraping drag down the metal. And once it came up so close that its wrong shining face was right at the glass keeping pace at 50 miles an hour, and it opened its mouth, and over the roar of the engine and the road I heard it make a sound, and the sound was the third thing I cannot explain, and I am only going to tell it once. It said my name, in a man's voice, in Gil Brantley's voice I think, though I never heard the man speak in life, a surveyman's flat ordinary voice saying halt, halt, pull over, right against the glass while the truck shook at 50 on the washboard, and I did not look at it again after that, and I did not slow down, and I did not answer, and I drove that 90 miles of dirt with both hands locked white on the wheel and my eyes straight ahead, and tears running down my face, and that thing running alongside in the starlight calling me by a dead man's name. I do not know at what point it left me. Somewhere in the last stretch, as the glow of the highway came up faint on the horizon. The pacing fell back, and the dust in my mirrors held nothing but dust, and when I finally hit the pavement of the highway, and the tires bit smooth asphalt and I turned toward Raymond Yazzi's distant lights, there was nothing behind me but the empty road and the enormous starry country, silver and still and innocent, as if none of it had happened, as if the desert had simply closed back over the whole thing like heat shimmer over the road. I drove to Raymond's gas station with the engine screaming, and I pulled in under his lights, and I sat there shaking and could not make my hands let go of the wheel. Raymond Yazzie came out. He took one look at my truck, at the long raking scrapes down the driver's door, at my face through the glass, and he did not ask me one single question. He just stood there a moment in the light of his station, and then he nodded, slowly, the way Joe Tritt nodded up in the Arctic, and Mose nodded in the rainforest, and every one of these careful old keepers of hard country nods at the man who has finally seen the thing they tried to warn him about, and he said only, "You got off the road." It was not a question, and I said, "Yes, Raymond, I got off the road." And he said, "Good. Then you do not go back on it. Not in the day, not in the night, not ever, you hear me. Some country is not ours, Holt, and that road runs through some of it, and the kindest thing it ever did for any man was let you drive out tonight." And that was all he would say, and he would not say even that much again. And I have respected his silence ever since, and I understand it now as the deepest kind of knowing, the kind that has kept his people alive in that country for 10,000 years, which is the knowing of what not to look at, and what not to name, and what roads not to drive. We never found Gil Brantley. Not really. I told the county where the line shack was, and a team went out, in numbers, in daylight, the way you have to. And they found the shack, and they found enough in it to close the case. And they wrote it the way it had to be written, which was that survey worker Gil Brantley had died in the desert of misadventure, exposure, lost from his vehicle, remains recovered, animal disturbance at the site, case closed. A man dying in that desert and his remains scattered by animals is a thing the world believes, because the world wants to believe it, and the alternative is not a thing a county report can hold. I did not tell them about the bones laid out in patterns, or the rank smell with no wind, or the thing that paced my truck for 90 miles, or the dead man's voice at my window. There was nowhere to write it. I signed what they put in front of me, and I have signed others since, because that road keeps its quiet tally, and they are always exposure, always misadventure, always the desert, and the desert never says one word. I left that work the following spring. 14 years, and I left it. And the people I worked with thought I had lost my nerve, and let them think it. The truth is the road. I could not keep a district that had that road in it. I could not keep driving out past those mesas knowing what ran the open country out there after the sun went down. I asked for a transfer, and I took a posting in another state, in a green and crowded and ordinary place with towns close together and lights all night and a horizon you can reach out and touch. And most days I am glad of it, and some days I miss the big silver desert silence so badly it is like grief, because I did love that country before it showed me the thing that lives in the empty part of it. Here is the part one have never put in a report, and it is not the kind of part you might expect, because this thing did not follow me home the way the others followed the men in their stories. It stayed out there. It belongs out there. That road is its road, and that country is its country, and it had no need of me once I was off its ground. What it left me with is smaller than that, and in its way worse, because it is with me all the time. I cannot drive an empty road at night anymore. Anywhere. Not the green ordinary country I live in now. Not a back lane. Not a stretch of dark highway with no other cars. The moment the lights of other people fall away and it is just my headlights and the night and the open shoulder running past, my hands lock up on the wheel and my heart starts going and my eyes start cutting to the edges of the light, to the ditch, to the dark beyond the dark, looking for a tall, lean shape that has risen up off four legs and started to pace me, and I have to pull over, or turn back, or call someone just to hear a human voice, and I have learned to plan my whole life so that I am never ever alone on an empty road after the sun goes down. My family does not fully understand it. I have never told them why. I have told them I do not like driving at night, which is true, and is a fraction of the truth, and that fraction is the size of a whole desert and a road I will not name, and a thing that ran beside my truck for 90 miles calling me by a dead man's voice. So if you take one thing from a tired old desert hand tonight, take this. If you are ever out in some great empty country, far from the lights of other people, on a long road with the land open and flat for miles, and you see something off to the side keeping pace with you, and you tell yourself it is a coyote, a dog, a trick of your tired eyes, and then you watch it rise up and run on two legs and start to close the distance, then you must understand that there is nothing you can do that will be enough except the one thing, which is to keep driving, and keep your eyes ahead, and do not slow down, and do not look at it, and above all, no matter whose voice it uses, no matter how it calls you, do not answer, and do not ever, for any reason, pull over. And when you reach the lights, and it falls back, and the road behind you is only road again, you do the thing that Raymond Yazzie spent his quiet wisdom trying to teach me before I was wise enough to hear it. You do not go back. Not in the day and not in the night and not ever. Some country is not ours. It never was. And the kindest thing it will ever do for you is let you drive out the one time. And the only fools who get a second warning are the ones who do not take the first. I took mine. Late, but I took it. That is the whole reason I am here to tell you. Take yours sooner than I took mine, and stay off the empty roads after dark. The summer of 2019 started like any other for me. An 11-year-old kid from suburban Minnesota. My parents had enrolled me in Cedar Ridge Summer Camp, a rustic facility nestled deep in the North Woods, 3 hours from the nearest town. The promotional brochures showed happy children swimming in crystal-clear lakes and roasting marshmallows around campfires, but nothing could have prepared me for what I would experience during those 2 weeks in July. I arrived on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, and my stomach churning with nervous excitement. The camp consisted of 12 weathered wooden cabins arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a central fire pit. Towering pine trees created a canopy so thick that even in broad daylight, shadows danced ominously across the ground. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine needles and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something musty and decaying that seemed to emanate from the deeper parts of the forest. My cabin, number 7, housed 8 boys, and was supervised by a counselor named Brett, a lanky college sophomore with sun-bleached hair and an easy smile that somehow never quite reached his eyes. My bunk was positioned near the back wall, directly beneath a small window that faced the woods. The floorboards creaked and groaned with every step, and the thin mattress smelled faintly of mildew despite the fresh sheets. My bunkmate was a kid named Connor from Milwaukee, a stocky 12-year-old with freckles and an infectious laugh. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared love of horror movies and video games. As we unpacked our belongings that first afternoon, Connor regaled me with stories he'd heard about the camp from his older brother, who had attended 3 years prior. Brandon told me weird stuff happens here at night, Connor whispered as we arranged our clothes in the shared dresser. He said they had to move kids out of cabin 12 because of some kind of incident. Nobody talks about it anymore. I laughed it off then, assuming it was just typical camp folklore designed to spook newcomers. The rational part of my brain dismissed such tales as harmless fun, but something about the way Connor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper made the hair on my arms stand up. That evening we gathered around the central fire pit for orientation and introductions. The flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, creating the illusion that the forest itself was alive and watching us. Brett and the other counselors led us through camp songs and shared the rules and expectations for our stay. Everything seemed normal enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed by something lurking just beyond the ring of firelight. As bedtime approached, the counselors herded us back to our respective cabins. The transition from the warm glow of the campfire to the suffocating darkness of the woods was jarring. Our flashlights created small circles of light that seemed pitifully inadequate against the vast expanse of blackness surrounding us. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made my heart skip a beat. Once inside cabin 7, Brett gave us the nightly rundown. Lights out by 10:30, no talking after that time, and absolutely no leaving the cabin until morning unless it was a genuine emergency. The bathroom facilities were housed in a separate building about 50 yards away, connected to our cabin by a narrow gravel path. A single motion sensor light illuminated the route, but its coverage was sporadic at best. As I lay in my bunk that first night, listening to the settling sounds of the old building and the gentle snoring of my fellow campers, I felt reasonably safe. The camp had been operating for over 30 years without any serious incidents, and the staff seemed competent and caring. Whatever stories Connor's brother had shared were probably exaggerated tales designed to enhance the camp's mystique. If only I had known then how wrong I was. The second night at Cedar Ridge started innocently enough. We had spent the day hiking along the lake shore, learning basic wilderness survival skills, and participating in a capture the flag tournament that left us all exhausted, but exhilarated. After a dinner of grilled hamburgers and corn on the cob, we returned to our cabin ready for a good night's rest. Connor and I had settled into our bunks around 10:15, whispering about the day's activities and making plans for tomorrow's canoeing expedition. Brett made his rounds, checking that everyone was accounted for and reasonably quiet, before settling into his own bed near the front of the cabin. The familiar sounds of settling wood and distant night birds gradually lulled most of the boys to sleep. I must have drifted off around 11, but sometime later, my watch showed it was exactly 2:17 a.m. when I first looked. I was jolted awake by a sound unlike anything I had ever heard. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping directly above my head, as if something enormous was walking across the roof with deliberate, measured steps. Each footfall sent vibrations through the entire structure, causing the wooden beams to creak and groan in protest. But it wasn't just the footsteps that made my stomach clench with fear. Between each heavy thud, I could distinctly hear what sounded like deep, labored breathing. The kind of breathing you might expect from something that had been running hard or carrying an enormous weight. The sound was so close that it seemed to be coming from just inches above the thin roof, and I could swear I felt warm air moving through the gaps in the wooden planks. I lay frozen in my bunk, every muscle tensed and my heart hammering so hard I was certain everyone in the cabin could hear it. Connor was still asleep in the bunk next to mine, his face peaceful and undisturbed. Across the room I could see that several other boys were stirring restlessly, but none seemed fully awake. Even Brett appeared to be sleeping soundly, his breathing deep and regular. The walking continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Whatever was up there moved with purpose, traversing the length of the roof from one end to the other in a methodical pattern. Occasionally, the footsteps would pause directly over my bunk, and during these moments, the breathing would become more pronounced, almost as if the thing was listening or searching for something specific. I wanted desperately to wake Connor or call out to Brett, but something primal and instinctual kept me silent. Every fiber of my being screamed that drawing attention to myself would be a terrible mistake. Instead, I pulled my sleeping bag up over my head and tried to convince myself that it was just a large animal. Maybe a bear or a moose that had somehow found its way onto the roof. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing, I knew that no animal moved with such deliberate precision. No animal breathed with that kind of measured, almost human-like rhythm. And no animal I could think of would be large enough to create footsteps that heavy while still being able to balance on a cabin roof. Eventually, the sounds stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the noise had been, and I spent the remaining hours until dawn straining my ears for any hint that the thing might return. When morning finally came, I felt as though I hadn't slept at all. At breakfast, I casually mentioned to Connor that I thought I had heard something on the roof during the night. He looked at me with a puzzled expression and said he hadn't heard anything unusual. When I brought it up with a couple of the other boys from our cabin, they gave me similar responses. Either I was the only light sleeper in the group, or whatever had been up there had specifically chosen to manifest itself only to me. The rational part of my brain suggested that I had probably been dreaming or experiencing some kind of sleep paralysis episode. Camp was a new environment, and it made sense that my subconscious might conjure up strange scenarios. But deep down, I knew what I had heard was real. The memory of those deliberate footsteps and labored breathing was too vivid, too detailed to be the product of my imagination. As we prepared for another day of camp activities, I made a mental note to pay closer attention to my surroundings and to trust my instincts if anything else seemed amiss. What I didn't realize was that the previous night's events were just the beginning of something far more terrifying than my young mind could have possibly conceived. The third night at Cedar Ridge brought with it a thick humidity that made the air feel heavy and oppressive. Storm clouds had been building throughout the day, and by evening, the atmosphere was charged with the electric tension that precedes a major thunderstorm. The temperature had dropped significantly from the sweltering heat we had endured earlier in the week, and most of us had changed into long pants and sweatshirts for the evening campfire. Our nightly gathering around the fire pit was cut short when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Brett and the other counselors quickly herded us back to our cabins as the wind picked up and lightning began to flicker in the distance. Within minutes of reaching cabin 7, the sky opened up completely, unleashing a torrential downpour that drummed against the roof with an intensity that made conversation nearly impossible. The storm created an entirely different atmosphere in our cabin. Instead of the usual easy chatter and gradual wind down toward bedtime, we found ourselves gathered around our bunks, listening to the thunder rolling across the lake and watching lightning illuminate the windows in brief, stark flashes. The violence of the weather outside made our small wooden shelter feel even more fragile and isolated than usual. Around 10 o'clock, Brett announced that it was time for final bathroom visits before lights out. Due to the severity of the storm, he decided to escort groups of boys to the bathroom facility, rather than letting us make the trip individually. The separate bathroom building, which housed toilets and sinks for 3 cabins, was only about 50 yards away, but the combination of driving rain and limited lighting made the journey treacherous. I was in the last group to make the trip, along with Connor and 2 other boys. We pulled on rain jackets and sprint across the muddy path, our flashlights creating weak beams that were quickly swallowed by the darkness and rain. The bathroom building was a simple concrete block structure with no windows, except for 4 small rectangular openings near the ceiling that were covered with metal grating. These openings were designed for ventilation, but also served as the only source of natural light during daytime hours. Once inside, we quickly took care of business while Brett waited outside under the small overhang by the door. The interior lighting consisted of 2 fluorescent fixtures that cast harsh institutional shadows across the white-painted walls. The combination of the storm noise and the buzzing of the fluorescent bulbs created an unsettling ambient sound that made my skin crawl. As we prepared to leave, Brett counted heads and realized that one of the boys from an earlier group had left the lights on when they departed. Camp rules were strict about conserving electricity, and leaving lights on unnecessarily was a violation that could result in lost privileges. Since I was the last person to use the facilities, Brett asked me to go back inside and turn off the lights before we returned to our cabin. I reluctantly agreed, though something about re-entering that sterile, harshly lit space made my stomach tighten with apprehension. The others waited outside while I pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped back into the bathroom. The fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead, casting their cold light across the concrete floor and utilitarian fixtures. I moved quickly toward the light switches, eager to complete this simple task and rejoin the group. But as I reached for the switches, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet by at least 20 degrees. My breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air, and I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms beneath my rain jacket. That's when I noticed movement outside one of the small grated windows near the ceiling. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch swaying in the storm wind, but as I looked more closely, I realized that what I was seeing defied any rational explanation. A figure, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin, was walking slowly around the perimeter of the bathroom building. The grated window was at least 8 feet from the ground, yet I could clearly see the upper portion of this thing as it moved past each opening in sequence. The lightning provided intermittent illumination that revealed horrifying details I wish I could forget. The figure's skin appeared gray and mottled, stretched tightly over a frame that seemed to consist mostly of jutting bones and sharp angles. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging almost to its knees, and its fingers appeared to be nothing more than skeletal protrusions covered by a thin membrane of flesh. But it was the way it moved that filled me with the most terror. Each step was deliberate and calculated, as if it was searching for something specific. The thing paused at each window, and though I couldn't see its face clearly through the grating, I had the unmistakable sensation that it was peering inside, looking for something or someone. When it reached the window directly above where I was standing, it stopped completely. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the figure remained motionless outside that window. I could hear its breathing now. The same deep, labored breathing I had heard on the roof 2 nights earlier, The sound was so close and so pronounced that I was certain it was looking directly at me through the metal grating. Terror flooded my system like ice water in my veins. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. My hands shook so violently that I could barely manage to flip the light switches, plunging the bathroom into complete darkness, except for the occasional flash of lightning from outside. I stumbled toward the door in the blackness, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. As I fumbled for the door handle, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away from the building, fading gradually into the storm noise. By the time I burst through the door and rejoined Brett and the other boys, whatever I had seen was gone. The return trip to our cabin was a blur of rain and terror. I said nothing to the others about what I had witnessed, partly because I doubted they would believe me, and partly because I was still trying to process what I had seen myself. Once back in our bunk, I lay awake for hours, listening to the storm and jumping at every sound, no matter how innocent. When morning came and the storm had passed, I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was a product of fear and imagination, amplified by the dramatic weather and the harsh lighting in the bathroom. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that something real and terrifying was stalking the grounds of Cedar Ridge Summer Camp. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of perfect weather that makes summer camps profitable and parents happy. The storm had washed the air clean, and everything sparkled with residual moisture that caught the early sunlight like thousands of tiny diamonds. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a beautiful day for outdoor activities and camp adventures, but I found it impossible to enjoy the sunshine and fresh air when my mind kept replaying the events of the previous night. During breakfast, I studied the faces of my fellow campers and the counselors, searching for any sign that someone else had seen or heard something unusual. Everyone seemed relaxed and cheerful, discussing plans for the day's activities and making jokes about who had been most frightened by the thunder. Connor noticed my distracted state and asked if I was feeling all right. I considered telling him about what I had witnessed in the bathroom, but something held me back. How could I explain that I had seen an 8-foot-tall skeletal figure stalking around the building without sounding like I was either lying or losing my mind? Instead, I mumbled something about not sleeping well due to the storm and tried to focus on my scrambled eggs. After breakfast, our activity schedule called for a nature hike along one of the trails that wound through the forest surrounding the camp. Brett divided us into smaller groups and assigned each group a different route, with the understanding that we would all meet back at the main lodge for lunch. Connor and I ended up in a group of 6 boys exploring what was called the North Trail, a 2-mile loop that supposedly offered excellent opportunities for wildlife observation and plant identification. As we walked deeper into the woods, I found myself paying attention to details that had previously escaped my notice. The trees in this part of the forest were older and larger than those immediately surrounding the camp, creating a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. The undergrowth was sparse, consisting mainly of ferns and moss that thrived in the perpetual twilight beneath the towering pines. About halfway through our hike, we came across something that made my blood freeze. In a small clearing where a massive oak tree had fallen years earlier, the ground was covered with what appeared to be footprints. But these weren't the prints of any animal I had ever seen or studied in nature books. They were humanoid in shape but impossibly large, easily 18 inches long and proportionally narrow. The impressions were deep, suggesting that whatever had made them was extremely heavy, and they led from the tree line on one side of the clearing to the other. I knelt down to examine the prints more closely while the other boys continued their plant collecting and general exploration. The level of detail preserved in the soft earth was remarkable. I could see distinct toe impressions, each one unnaturally long and ending in what appeared to be sharp points. The heel print was narrow and deep, as if the thing that made it walked primarily on the balls of its feet. "Hey, check this out!" called one of the other boys from across the clearing. "There's something weird over here." We all gathered around what he had discovered, scratches in the bark of several trees that formed an unmistakable pattern. The marks were too high off the ground to have been made by any normal animal, and they were too regular and deliberate to be the result of natural wear or storm damage. Someone or something had carved these symbols into the trees with considerable force and precision. Brett, who had been examining some wildflowers nearby, came over to investigate. When he saw the scratches, his expression changed from casual interest to something that looked like concern, or possibly recognition. He studied the marks for several long moments before announcing that it was time to move on and complete our hike. "What do you think made those marks?" Connor asked as we resumed walking. "Probably just bears marking their territory," Brett replied, but his tone lacked conviction. "It's pretty common in these woods." I wanted to point out that the scratches were too high and too precise to be bear marks, and that the footprints we had found didn't match any bear tracks I had ever seen. But something about Brett's demeanor discouraged further questions. He seemed eager to put distance between our group and the clearing, and he maintained a brisk pace for the remainder of our hike. That afternoon, during a brief rest period between activities, I decided to do some investigating on my own. The camp had a small library in the main lodge, consisting mostly of nature guides and basic reference books for educational purposes. I told Connor I wanted to look up some of the plants we had seen on our hike, which wasn't entirely untrue, and spent an hour browsing through field guides and wildlife references. What I found was both fascinating and terrifying. Several of the books contained sections on local folklore and historical accounts of the region, including stories dating back to the early logging days of the late 1800s. According to these accounts, the area around what was now Cedar Ridge had been the site of numerous unexplained disappearances and strange sightings over the past century and a half. The most relevant account came from a 1923 newspaper article that had been reprinted in one of the local history books. It described the discovery of a logging camp that had been mysteriously abandoned overnight, with no signs of struggle or obvious explanation for why the workers had fled. The only clues were a series of enormous footprints found around the perimeter of the camp and strange scratches carved into nearby trees. The description of the footprints matched what we had seen in the clearing that morning with unsettling accuracy. According to the article, they were of human configuration, but far larger than any man could produce, with elongated toes terminating in what appeared to be claws or talons. The tree scratches were described as deliberate markings suggesting intelligence and purpose rather than random animal behavior. As I read these accounts, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades, there would be reports of unusual activity in this part of the forest: missing persons, abandoned campsites, livestock found dead under mysterious circumstances. The incidents would cluster over a period of weeks or months, then disappear for years at a time, only to resurface when conditions were right. The most recent cluster of incidents had occurred in the summer of 2016, just 3 years before my arrival at camp. According to a brief mention in a local newspaper archive, a family camping in the area had reported seeing a tall, emaciated figure stalking around their campsite during the night. They had packed up and left the following morning, despite having reserved the site for a full week. By the time I finished my research, I was more convinced than ever that something genuinely dangerous was active in the area around Cedar Ridge. The question was whether the camp administrators were aware of this history and simply choosing to ignore it, or if they were deliberately concealing information that could affect the safety of their campers. Either way, I realized that I was probably on my own when it came to dealing with whatever was lurking in the woods around our camp. The rational adult response would be to pack up and leave immediately. But as an 11-year-old camper with no control over my transportation or living arrangements, that option wasn't available to me. All I could do was stay alert, trust my instincts, and hope that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on before something truly terrible happened. By the 5th night at Cedar Ridge, I had developed a routine of hypervigilance that was beginning to take a serious toll on my physical and mental state. I was sleeping poorly, eating little, and jumping at every unexpected sound or movement. Connor had noticed my increasing anxiety and had begun asking pointed questions about my well-being, but I continued to deflect his concerns with vague explanations about homesickness and adjustment difficulties. The truth was that I had been experiencing minor encounters with whatever was stalking the campgrounds almost every night since the bathroom incident. These weren't dramatic, obvious sightings like what I had witnessed during the storm, but rather subtle signs that something unnatural was taking an active interest in our presence. On the fourth night, I had awakened around 3 a.m. to the sound of something large moving through the underbrush directly behind our cabin. The movement was too deliberate and sustained to be a deer or other normal wildlife, and it seemed to circle our building multiple times before moving off toward the lake. In the morning, I found a series of broken branches and disturbed vegetation that traced the exact path I had heard the night before. The night after that, I noticed that the motion sensor light on the path to the bathroom was triggering repeatedly throughout the early morning hours, turning on for exactly 90 seconds before shutting off again. This cycle continued every 10 to 15 minutes from approximately 2 a.m. until dawn. But whenever I peered out the window to see what might be triggering the sensor, I saw nothing but empty pathway. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that had begun emanating from the forest around midnight each night. They started as distant, almost subsonic groaning noises that seemed to come from deep underground. Gradually, these sounds would increase in frequency and intensity until they resembled a kind of primitive communication. Long, mournful calls that were answered by similar sounds from different directions in the woods. On the fifth night, these patterns escalated to a level that I could no longer ignore or rationalize away. Connor and I had gone to bed at the usual time, and I had spent several hours lying awake listening for any unusual activity. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the now familiar sound of heavy footsteps on the roof, but this time they were accompanied by a new element that made my stomach clench with terror. Scratching. Deliberate, rhythmic scratching that sounded like something was trying to claw its way through the wooden shingles and into our cabin. The scratching started directly above my bunk and continued for what felt like hours. I could hear individual claws or talons scraping against the wood, accompanied by the occasional sound of small pieces of debris raining down on the roof as material was gouged away. The rhythm was too regular and purposeful to be the result of an animal trying to build a nest or seek shelter. This was something attempting to gain entry to our sleeping area. I lay frozen in my bunk, afraid to move or make any sound that might draw attention to my specific location. Around me, my fellow campers continued to sleep peacefully, apparently oblivious to the activity taking place just inches above their heads. Even Connor, who was normally a light sleeper, showed no signs of being disturbed by the noise. After what seemed like an eternity, the scratching stopped as abruptly as it had begun. But instead of the relief I had expected to feel, I was gripped by an even more intense fear. If the thing had stopped trying to claw through the roof, what was it planning to do instead? My question was answered about 20 minutes later when I heard the soft sound of the cabin's front door opening. The door was supposed to be locked from the inside with a simple sliding bolt. But I distinctly heard the metallic scraping sound of the bolt being moved and the creak of hinges as the door swung open. Brett's sleeping area was positioned so that he should have been awakened immediately by any intrusion, but his breathing remained deep and regular. Soft footsteps began moving across the cabin floor toward the sleeping area where the campers' bunks were arranged. The footsteps were careful and measured, avoiding the creakiest floorboards with the precision of someone intimately familiar with the building's layout. I could track the progress of whatever had entered by listening to the slight sounds of displaced air and the barely perceptible vibrations transmitted through the wooden structure. The footsteps paused at the foot of each bunk, remaining motionless for 30 to 40 seconds before moving on to the next sleeping boy. I realized with growing horror that the thing was examining each of us individually, perhaps trying to determine which camper might be most suitable for whatever purpose it had in mind. When the footsteps reached my bunk, I had to exercise every ounce of self-control I possessed to maintain the facade of sleep. Through barely cracked eyelids, I could see a tall, impossibly thin shadow looming over my bed. The shadow had no defined edges, seeming to blend into the surrounding darkness, but I could sense its presence with a clarity that transcended normal sight. For what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, the thing stood absolutely still beside my bunk. I could hear its breathing, the same deep, labored respirations I had heard before, and I could smell something that reminded me of wet earth and decay. The temperature around my bed seemed to drop by several degrees, and I had to concentrate on keeping my own breathing slow and regular, despite the panic flooding my system. Eventually, the shadow moved away from my bunk and continued its survey of the other sleeping boys. When it had apparently examined everyone in the cabin, The footsteps retraced their path toward the front door. I heard the door open and close again, followed by the sound of the bolt sliding back into place. But instead of leaving the area entirely, whatever had been in our cabin began circling the building from the outside. I could track its movement by listening to the soft sounds of displaced gravel and vegetation as it moved around the perimeter. Every few minutes it would pause at one of the windows, and I could sense it peering inside, as if memorizing details about our sleeping arrangements for future reference. This surveillance continued until approximately 4 a.m., when the sounds finally faded into the general background noise of the forest. By the time dawn arrived, I was emotionally and physically exhausted, but I was also more determined than ever to find out what was happening at Cedar Ridge, and why none of the adults seemed aware of or concerned about the obvious danger we were facing. As my fellow campers began stirring and preparing for another day of camp activities, I made a decision that would ultimately change the course of events. I was going to confront Brett directly about the strange occurrences, regardless of whether he believed me or dismissed my concerns as the overactive imagination of a frightened child. Something evil was stalking the grounds of Cedar Ridge Summer Camp, and it was escalating its behavior with each passing night. If the adults in charge weren't going to protect us, then I would have to find a way to protect myself and my fellow campers, even if it meant revealing knowledge that no 11-year-old should possess. The sixth morning at Cedar Ridge dawned gray and oppressive, with thick clouds that seemed to press down on the forest like a suffocating blanket. The usual cheerful breakfast chatter was replaced by a subdued atmosphere that I initially attributed to the gloomy weather, but as I looked around the dining hall, I noticed that several other campers appeared tired and on edge. Connor picked at his pancakes without enthusiasm, and when I asked if he was feeling all right, he gave me a strange look before answering. "I had the weirdest dreams last night," he said quietly. "I kept dreaming that someone was in our cabin, standing next to my bed and watching me sleep. It felt so real that I woke up several times to check, but there was never anyone there." My blood went cold. Connor's dream perfectly matched what I had witnessed during the early morning hours, but from his perspective as someone who had remained asleep throughout the actual intrusion. If whatever was stalking us had the ability to influence the sleep and dreams of its targets, it explained why I seemed to be the only camper fully aware of the ongoing danger. I looked around the dining hall and noticed similar signs of disturbed sleep among several other boys. Dark circles under their eyes, distracted expressions, and an overall sense of unease that seemed disproportionate to the minor discomfort of sleeping in unfamiliar surroundings. Whatever was affecting the camp wasn't limiting its attention to our specific cabin. After breakfast, I asked Brett if I could speak with him privately about a personal matter. He agreed, and we walked to a quiet area behind the main lodge where we could talk without being overheard by other campers. I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind dozens of times, but now that the moment had arrived, I found it difficult to know where to begin. "Brett," I said finally, "have you noticed anything unusual happening around camp at night? Strange sounds or other things?" His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but I caught a flash of something that looked like recognition before he composed himself and assumed a concerned counselor demeanor. "What kind of strange sounds?" he asked carefully. I decided to be direct. "Footsteps on the roof, something walking around the buildings, heavy breathing. And last night, something came into our cabin while everyone was sleeping." Brett was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was much more serious than his usual casual tone. "How long have you been noticing these things?" "Since the second night. It's been getting worse every night since then." "Have you mentioned this to any of the other boys?" "No. They all seem to sleep through it, except Connor thinks he's been having weird dreams." Brett nodded slowly, as if my answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Listen," he said, "I need you to promise me that you won't discuss this with any of the other campers. Can you do that?" "Why? What's going on?" "There are some things about this place that most people don't need to know about. Things that we normally don't have to deal with during camp sessions. But every few years, when conditions are right, we get some unusual activity in the area. What kind of activity? Brett glanced around to make sure we were still alone, then continued in a voice barely above a whisper. The land where this camp is built has a long history of things that can't be easily explained. Most of the time, whatever lives in these woods keeps to itself and doesn't bother people. But sometimes, especially during certain weather patterns or when there are a lot of people around, it gets curious. It? We're not exactly sure what it is. The local authorities have theories, but nothing that would satisfy most people. What we do know is that it's been here longer than the camp, longer than the logging operations that came before, probably longer than any human settlement in this area. I felt a mixture of validation and terror. At least I wasn't going crazy, but the confirmation that something genuinely dangerous was stalking us wasn't exactly comforting either. Does the camp director know about this? I asked. The camp director, the local sheriff, the Department of Natural Resources, they all know. There's an informal understanding that as long as the incidents remain minor and no one gets hurt, everyone just manages the situation quietly. What do you mean, manages the situation? We keep detailed records of any unusual activity. We have protocols for moving campers out of certain cabins if necessary, and we have arrangements with local law enforcement for emergency evacuations if things get too serious. How serious do things usually get? Brett hesitated before answering. In the 32 years this camp has been operating, we've had to evacuate early 3 times. The last time was 2016. A family camping in the area reported an encounter that was significant enough to warrant shutting down operations for the remainder of that session. I remembered the newspaper account I had found in the camp library, the family who had packed up and left after seeing a tall, emaciated figure near their campsite. Apparently, their encounter had been serious enough to affect the camp's operations as well. What makes you think I can see it when the other kids can't? Some people are more sensitive to this kind of thing than others. Usually it's adults who have the strongest reactions, but occasionally a child will be particularly aware of unusual activity. In those cases, we try to provide extra support and monitoring to keep everyone safe. Extra support like what? Well, for starters, I'm going to move you to a different cabin tonight. Cabin 3 is farther from the tree line and has better lighting around the perimeter. I'll also make sure that you're never alone when moving between buildings after dark. What about Connor and the other boys in Cabin 7? They'll be fine. Whatever's out there seems to focus its attention on people who can actually perceive it clearly. As long as they continue sleeping through the encounters, they're not at significant risk. I wanted to ask more questions, but Brett indicated that our conversation was over and that we needed to rejoin the group for the morning's scheduled activities. As we walked back toward the main camp area, I felt a confusing mixture of emotions. On one hand, I was relieved to know that I wasn't losing my mind and that responsible adults were aware of the situation. On the other hand, the casual way Brett discussed managing encounters with an unknown entity didn't inspire confidence in the camp's ability to keep us truly safe. That afternoon, during what was supposed to be a rest period, I was moved to Cabin 3 along with my belongings. My new bunkmates were friendly enough, but I could tell that they had been briefed about my adjustment difficulties and instructed to be supportive and inclusive. Brett had clearly crafted a cover story that explained my cabin change without revealing the true reason. As evening approached and we prepared for another night at Cedar Ridge, I found myself hoping that the change of location would be enough to end my encounters with whatever was lurking in the forest. But deep down, I suspected that simply moving to a different cabin wouldn't be sufficient to solve a problem that had been developing for decades. Whatever was out there had taken a specific interest in me, and I doubted that 50 yards of additional distance from the tree line would be enough to discourage its attention. My first night in Cabin 3 started peacefully enough. The building was indeed farther from the forest edge, positioned in the center of the camp complex with better lighting and more activity around it. Brett had assigned me a bunk near the front of the cabin, close to where the counselor slept, and he had made a point of checking on me multiple times during the evening. For the first few hours after lights out, I actually managed to relax somewhat. The normal sounds of settling wood and distant forest noise seemed less threatening in this new environment, and the presence of the counselor so nearby provided a degree of comfort I hadn't felt since arriving at camp. But around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a sound that made my heart skip several beats. Scratching. The same deliberate, rhythmic scratching I had heard on the roof of Cabin 7, but this time it was coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Whatever was out there wasn't alone anymore. I lay in my bunk, listening to the sounds of claws or talons scraping against wood and metal from at least 3 different locations around the cabin. The scratching was accompanied by low, guttural sounds that were clearly some form of communication between the entities responsible for the noise. They were coordinating their efforts, working together to achieve some specific goal. The activity continued for about 20 minutes before shifting to a new phase that was even more terrifying. I began to hear the sounds of the entities testing various entry points around the building, rattling door handles, probing window latches, and examining the foundation for weak spots. They were methodical and patient, taking time to thoroughly evaluate each potential avenue of access. When they reached the front door of our cabin, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. The metal bolt that secured the door from the inside was being manipulated from the outside, sliding slowly but steadily toward the unlocked position. Whatever these things were, they had learned to defeat the simple security measures that protected sleeping campers. I knew I had to wake the counselor, but I was terrified that any movement or sound would draw the entity's attention to my specific location. Instead, I remained motionless and watched through barely opened eyes as the front door of our cabin swung silently open. 3 figures entered our sleeping area, moving with the same careful precision I had witnessed during the previous intrusion. But this time, I could see them more clearly due to the better lighting around Cabin 3. What I saw defied every rational explanation my young mind could conceive. The entities were humanoid in general shape, but grotesquely distorted in their proportions. They stood at least 8 feet tall, with skeletal frames that seemed to consist mostly of jutting bones covered by gray mottled skin. Their arms were disproportionately long, reaching almost to their knees, and their fingers appeared to be nothing more than sharpened bone protrusions. But it was their faces that filled me with the most horror. They had human features, but stretched and elongated beyond any natural possibility. Their eyes were large and completely black, reflecting available light like the eyes of nocturnal animals. Their mouths were filled with teeth that were too numerous and too sharp, creating expressions that suggested intelligence mixed with predatory hunger. The 3 entities moved through our cabin with obvious familiarity, examining each sleeping camper with the same methodical attention I had experienced in Cabin 7. But this time, their behavior was different. Instead of simply observing, they seemed to be making selections, pointing at specific boys and communicating in their low, guttural language. When they reached my bunk, all 3 entities stopped and focused their attention on me. I knew immediately that my pretense of sleep wasn't fooling them. They were aware that I could see them clearly, and that I understood the danger they represented. For several long minutes, we engaged in a silent standoff, with me trying to remain motionless while they studied me with obvious interest. Finally, one of the entities reached toward me with its skeletal hand, extending those sharpened finger bones until they were just inches from my face. I could smell the odor of decay and wet earth that seemed to emanate from its skin, and I could hear its breathing, that same deep, labored respiration that had become the soundtrack to my nightmares. At the last possible moment, when I was certain that the thing was about to make physical contact, I couldn't maintain my facade any longer. I bolted upright in my bunk and screamed as loudly as I could, hoping to wake everyone in the cabin and scare away the intruders. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entities recoiled from my sudden movement and vocalizations as if they had been physically burned. They retreated toward the front door with surprising speed, their forms seeming to become less solid and defined as they moved away from the interior lighting. But instead of fleeing the area entirely, they positioned themselves just outside the cabin and began making sounds unlike anything I had ever heard. The guttural communication was replaced by high-pitched wailing that rose and fell in complex patterns, creating a sound that seemed designed to inspire maximum terror and disorientation. My screaming had awakened everyone in the cabin, including the counselor, who immediately turned on all available lights and began checking on each camper. The other boys were confused and frightened by the sudden awakening, but none of them seemed to have any awareness of what had actually transpired. "What's wrong?" the counselor asked as he reached my bunk. "They were in here," I said, pointing toward the front door. "3 of them. They were looking at all of us and they were going to—" I stopped speaking when I realized that the door was closed and securely bolted from the inside. There was no evidence that anyone or anything had entered our cabin, and no indication that the intrusion I had witnessed had actually occurred. But the wailing from outside continued, growing louder and more complex, as additional voices joined the chorus from different locations around the camp. Soon, the entire forest seemed to be alive with the sound of these entities calling to each other, creating a symphony of terror that was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Other campers in nearby cabins began waking up and adding their own confused voices to the growing chaos. Counselors emerged from their quarters with flashlights, trying to determine the source of the disturbance and restore order to the camp. Brett appeared at our cabin door within minutes, and after a brief conversation with our counselor, he asked to speak with me privately outside. Despite my terror of leaving the relative safety of the building, I followed him to the same quiet area where we had talked that morning. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said without preamble. I described the entire encounter in detail, from the initial scratching sounds to the final retreat of the entities when I screamed. Brett listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if my account confirmed information he already possessed. "The wailing is new," he said when I finished. "We've never had them react that aggressively to being detected. Usually they withdraw immediately if they realize someone is awake and aware of their presence." "What does that mean?" "It means the situation is escalating beyond what we normally experience. I need to make some phone calls and probably implement our emergency protocols." As if to emphasize his point, the wailing from the forest suddenly intensified, and we could see flashlight beams moving through the trees as additional entities responded to whatever call had been issued. The sound was so loud and so disturbing that several of the younger campers had begun crying, despite the counselor's efforts to calm and reassure them. "We're evacuating," Brett said firmly. "I'm calling for transportation to pick up all campers first thing in the morning. This has gone beyond what we can safely manage." I felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that we would soon be away from this place and whatever lived in the surrounding forest, but guilt that my inability to remain hidden had apparently triggered a response that was threatening the entire camp operation. "Is this my fault?" I asked. "No," Brett replied without hesitation. "This has been building since the day you arrived. If anything, your awareness of what was happening probably prevented something much worse from occurring." As we returned to the cabin to help with the evacuation preparations, I realized that my summer camp experience was about to end in a way I could never have imagined. But I also understood that I had gained knowledge and experiences that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Knowledge about things that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of normal human understanding. The entities continued their wailing throughout the remainder of the night, creating a constant backdrop of otherworldly sound that made sleep impossible for anyone in the camp. By dawn, their voices had faded back into the forest depths, but the memory of that terrible chorus would haunt my dreams for years to come. The evacuation of Cedar Ridge Summer Camp began at first light, with a convoy of buses and vans arriving to transport 43 campers and 12 staff members back to their respective homes. The official explanation given to parents was an unexpected closure due to severe weather damage and safety concerns, which was technically accurate even if it didn't address the true nature of the threat. As we loaded our belongings onto the buses, I noticed that several of the other campers seemed relieved to be leaving, even though they couldn't articulate why. The events of the previous night had left everyone on edge, and the unnatural silence that had settled over the forest with the dawn felt more ominous than comforting. Connor sat beside me on the bus, but our usual easy conversation was replaced by an uncomfortable silence. I could tell that he wanted to ask questions about what had really happened, but something prevented him from voicing his concerns directly. "Those sounds last night," he said finally, as our bus pulled away from the camp. They weren't anything normal, were they? No, I replied quietly. They weren't. Did you see anything? When you woke everyone up screaming? I considered how much to tell him. Part of me wanted to share the full truth about what I had witnessed, but another part recognized that some knowledge was too disturbing to pass along to someone who hadn't asked for it. I saw enough to know that we needed to get out of there, I said finally. Connor nodded and didn't press for additional details. As our bus traveled the winding forest roads away from Cedar Ridge, I watched through the rear window until the camp buildings disappeared entirely behind the trees. I had the distinct feeling that I was leaving something unfinished, but I was grateful to be putting distance between myself and whatever lived in those woods. The 3-hour bus ride gave me time to process what I had experienced and to begin formulating how I would explain the early end of my camp session to my parents. I decided to stick close to the official story. Severe weather had damaged some facilities and created unsafe conditions that required immediate evacuation. It wasn't entirely false, and it avoided the need to discuss elements that no rational adult would be likely to believe. When I arrived home that afternoon, my parents were surprised by my early return, but seemed satisfied with my explanation. They assumed that my subdued mood and obvious fatigue were natural reactions to the disappointment of having my camp experience cut short, and they gave me space to readjust to being home without excessive questioning. Over the following weeks, I found myself researching everything I could find about the history of the area around Cedar Ridge. I read accounts of the logging operations that had operated there in the late 1800s, the various camping and recreational facilities that had been established over the years, and the folklore that had developed around unexplained incidents in the region. What I discovered confirmed that my experiences were part of a pattern that stretched back over more than a century. Every few years, when conditions were apparently right, there would be reports of unusual activity in the forest. Missing persons, abandoned campsites, encounters with entities that defied conventional explanation. The incidents would cluster over a period of weeks or months, then disappear for years at a time. I also learned that Cedar Ridge Summer Camp had indeed been evacuated twice before during its 32-year history, in 1994 and 2016. In both cases, the official explanation had involved weather-related safety concerns, but local newspaper accounts hinted at more complex circumstances that weren't fully explained to the public. About 6 months after my experience at the camp, I received an unexpected phone call from Brett. He was calling to check on how I was doing and to provide some closure about what had happened during my stay. The camp won't be reopening, he told me. The owners have decided that the liability issues have become too significant to continue operations. What about the things in the forest? They're still there as far as we know. The Department of Natural Resources has expanded the protected area around the former campsite and restricted public access. Officially, it's for environmental conservation purposes. Do you think they'll ever bother people again? Probably. Every few years, when conditions are right, someone will have an encounter. But hopefully future incidents will be isolated and manageable, without putting large groups of people at risk. Brett's call provided some closure, but it also confirmed that I had been part of something much larger and more complex than a simple summer camp experience. I had encountered entities that existed outside normal human understanding, and I had survived that encounter because of a combination of awareness, luck, and the intervention of adults who understood the true nature of the threat. As I grew older and gained more perspective on what had happened to me, I came to understand that there are places in the world where the normal rules of reality don't apply completely. These places exist on the margins of human experience, usually avoided or ignored by people who instinctively recognize their dangerous nature. Cedar Ridge Summer Camp had been built on one of these marginal places, and for 32 years, dedicated staff members had managed to operate there safely by acknowledging the unusual nature of their environment and taking appropriate precautions. But eventually, the risks had become too great to justify continued operations. Today, the former campsite is overgrown and abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the forest that surrounds it. The buildings have been removed, and most traces of human habitation have been erased. But sometimes, on quiet nights when conditions are right, hikers in the area report hearing sounds from the forest that can't be easily explained. sounds that remind me of the wailing chorus I heard during my final night at Cedar Ridge. I still think about those entities sometimes, wondering what they are and where they came from. I wonder if they're still there, waiting in the depths of the forest for the next group of unsuspecting visitors to stumble into their territory. And I'm grateful that my encounter with them ended with an evacuation rather than something far worse. The experience taught me that the world contains mysteries that may never be fully understood or explained, and that sometimes the wisest response to such mysteries is simply to acknowledge their existence and maintain a respectful distance. Some places are meant to remain wild and unexplored, and some entities are better left undisturbed in their ancient territories. Cedar Ridge is one of those places, and I have no intention of ever returning to find out what might be waiting there in the shadows between the trees. I've kept this story buried for 3 years now, locked away in the darkest corners of my mind where nightmares take root and grow. But the weight of silence has become unbearable, and I find myself compelled to write these words, if only to warn others who might venture into the wilderness surrounding Yellowstone National Park during the summer months. What I'm about to tell you happened in July of 2023, when I was 29 years old, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the places we consider safe. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that you understand every word of what follows. I've lived on the outskirts of Yellowstone for most of my adult life, drawn by the raw beauty and the promise of solitude that only true wilderness can provide. The park draws millions of visitors each year, but there are places, hidden spots known only to locals, where you can escape the crowds and find yourself truly alone with nature. Or so I thought. That particular July had been unusually hot, with temperatures soaring well above normal for the region. The drought had left the landscape brittle and parched, creating an atmosphere of tension that seemed to permeate everything. Even the wildlife appeared agitated, moving in patterns that defied their usual behavior. I should have recognized these as warning signs, but hindsight is a luxury I didn't possess then. The plan had been simple enough. My usual camping group, 5 of us who'd been exploring these mountains together for years, had arranged to meet at one of our favorite spots, a secluded clearing about 45 minutes' drive from the nearest main road. We'd discovered this place during a hunting trip 2 years prior, and it had become our go-to location for weekend getaways. The clearing was surrounded by dense pine forest, with a small stream running along its eastern edge and a natural rock formation that provided excellent wind protection. I'd driven up earlier that afternoon to set up my camp and secure our usual spot. The area operated on a first-come, first-served basis, and with the increased camping activity that summer, I wanted to ensure we wouldn't arrive to find our sanctuary occupied by strangers. I'd pitched my tent with military precision. 4 seasons of camping had taught me the importance of proper setup. Each stake was driven deep into the rocky soil, and I'd weighted the tent with large stones I'd carefully selected from the stream bed. Inside, I'd left my sleeping bag, a camp chair, and several other items specifically to keep the tent anchored against any wind that might arise. The drive back to town had been uneventful, though I remember feeling oddly unsettled by the unusual silence in the forest. Typically, the woods would be alive with birdsong and the rustling of small animals, but that afternoon, everything seemed muted, as if the very landscape was holding its breath. I attributed this to the heat and the ongoing drought conditions that had been affecting the region for weeks. When I returned to the clearing just before sunset, my world tilted on its axis. The campsite was completely empty. Not just empty. It was as if my tent had never existed. I parked my truck exactly where I had that afternoon, and walked to the precise spot where I'd set up camp. The ground showed no indentation where the tent had been, no holes where the stakes had been driven, no disturbance in the soil whatsoever. Even the rocks I'd carefully placed around the perimeter had vanished without a trace. I spent 20 minutes searching the entire clearing, convinced I must have been mistaken about the location. But the landscape was etched in my memory. The distinctive dead pine that stood guard at the clearing's northern edge. The peculiar boulder formation that resembled a sleeping giant. The bend in the stream where we'd found that perfect swimming hole. This was definitely the right place, and my camp had simply ceased to exist. The implications sent ice through my veins. Removing a properly staked tent and all its contents without leaving any trace would require considerable time and effort. The stakes alone would have taken significant force to extract from the rocky ground. Someone had been watching. Someone had waited for me to leave, then systematically erased every sign of my presence with methodical precision that spoke of experience and planning. I checked my phone. No signal, as expected. The nearest cell tower was over 15 miles away, blocked by the mountainous terrain that made this area so perfectly isolated. The isolation that had once felt like freedom now felt like a trap. I was alone in the wilderness with an unknown threat and no way to call for help. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in my truck and drive straight home to call the local sheriff's department and report the theft. But my friends were already on their way, driving through mountain roads that would take them over an hour to navigate. They'd invested considerable time and effort into this weekend trip, and I knew they'd be disappointed if I bailed without a compelling reason. More importantly, whoever had taken my gear might still be in the area. The thought of them watching my friends arrive, potentially targeting them next, was unbearable. I decided to drive back toward the main road until I could get cell service and warn the others about what had happened. The drive down the winding mountain road felt different now, charged with an undercurrent of menace that transformed familiar landmarks into potential hiding spots. Every shadow between the trees could conceal a watcher. Every bend in the road could reveal an ambush. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of red and orange that reminded me uncomfortably of dried blood. When I finally got a signal, I called my friend Kevin, who was driving up with his girlfriend Heather and my buddy Brian. Kevin answered on the second ring, his voice crackling through the poor connection. "Hey man, we're about 20 minutes out. Everything set up?" I explained what had happened, trying to keep the growing panic out of my voice. There was a long pause before Kevin responded. "That's seriously messed up. You sure you had the right spot?" "Positive? Someone took everything. Stakes, rocks, even the tent footprint. It's like it was never there." Another pause. I could hear muffled conversation as Kevin conferred with the others. "Look, we've been planning this for weeks, and we're already most of the way there. Why don't we just camp somewhere else in the area? We've got enough gear to share." The rational part of my brain knew this was exactly the wrong decision. But the thought of disappointing my friends, combined with a stubborn refusal to be intimidated by whoever was playing these games, overrode my better judgment. I agreed to meet them at the clearing and help find an alternative campsite. By the time we all assembled, full darkness had fallen. Kevin, Heather, Brian, and our fifth member, Tony, arrived within minutes of each other, their headlights cutting through the blackness like searchlights. We spent an hour exploring the area with flashlights, eventually settling on a spot about a quarter-mile from the original clearing, near a cluster of large boulders that would provide some shelter from the wind. As we set up the new camp, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement or watching eyes. The others seemed oblivious to my paranoia, chatting and laughing as they arranged their gear. But I noticed things they didn't. The way the normal forest sounds remained conspicuously absent. The feeling of being observed that raised the hair on the back of my neck. The way our flashlight beams seemed to catch brief glimpses of movement just beyond their reach. Kevin had brought his portable radio, and we tuned it to a classic rock station that provided some background noise to fill the unnatural silence. But even the music felt wrong in this place, as if the very air was rejecting our attempts at normalcy. Every song seemed to end too abruptly, replaced by static that sounded almost like whispers. By midnight, we had a decent fire going and had settled into the familiar rhythm of camping conversation. Kevin and Brian traded stories about their recent hunting trips, while Heather shared updates about her job at the local hospital. Tony, always the joker of our group, regaled us with increasingly ridiculous anecdotes from his work as a park ranger, though I noticed even his usually infectious humor seemed forced tonight. As the evening wore on, I found myself volunteering to keep the fire going, using the excuse to stay awake and maintain watch over our surroundings. The others gradually began to yawn and stretch, preparing for sleep. By 1:30 a.m., they had all retreated to their tents, leaving me alone with the dying fire and the weight of the surrounding darkness. I had brought my truck for exactly this reason: a secure, lockable shelter that no one could enter without me knowing. My concealed carry permit was current, and my Glock 19 was loaded and ready. I also had a canister of bear spray clipped to my belt, though I was beginning to suspect that bears were the least of our concerns. As I settled into the driver's seat of my truck, I cracked the windows just enough to hear any approaching sounds while maintaining security. The night air was surprisingly cool, a relief after the oppressive heat of the day. I positioned myself so I could see both the campfire and the surrounding tree line, my hand resting comfortably on the grip of my pistol. The last thing I remember before drifting off was the sound of something large moving through the forest, just beyond the range of the firelight. But exhaustion finally claimed me, and I fell into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of watching eyes and vanishing tents. Something jerked me from sleep at 3:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because the green glow of my truck's digital clock was the first thing I focused on when I snapped awake. My heart was already racing, though my conscious mind hadn't yet processed what had triggered my body's alarm system. I remained perfectly still, listening with the intensity of a hunted animal, trying to identify what had pulled me from sleep. The fire had died down to barely glowing embers, casting almost no light beyond our immediate campsite. The darkness felt different now, thicker, more oppressive, as if it had weight and purpose. I strained my ears, fighting to hear over the thundering of my own pulse, and that's when I detected it: the unmistakable sound of something moving through the forest with deliberate, measured steps. These weren't the random rustlings of nocturnal wildlife going about their business. This was methodical movement, the kind that spoke of intelligence and intent. Whatever was out there was being careful about its approach, but not careful enough. I could hear the soft crush of pine needles underfoot, the occasional snap of a small branch, the whisper of fabric brushing against bark. The footsteps seemed to be circling our campsite, maintaining a consistent distance of perhaps 30 to 40 yards. They moved with a predator's patience, never hurrying, never pausing for long. I counted at least 2 distinct sets of footfalls, possibly 3, though the acoustics of the forest made it difficult to be certain. What terrified me most was the deliberate nature of their movement. This wasn't random wandering, but reconnaissance. I reached slowly for my pistol, my fingers closing around the familiar grip. The metal felt reassuringly solid, though I hoped desperately I wouldn't need to use it. My bear spray was clipped to my belt, and I quietly freed it as well, holding both defensive tools ready while maintaining my position in the driver's seat. The circling continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. During this time, I became acutely aware of details I'd never noticed before. The way my own breathing seemed thunderously loud in the confined space of the truck cab. The faint metallic taste of adrenaline coating my tongue. The way every shadow beyond the dying fire seemed to shift and writhe with potential threat. Then the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the sound of movement had been. At least when I could hear them, I knew approximately where they were. Now they could be anywhere, directly behind my truck, crouched beside the tents of my sleeping friends, or positioned at the tree line with weapons trained on our campsite. The not knowing was a special kind of torture. I waited, muscles coiled tight with tension, for nearly 5 minutes of absolute silence. Just as I was beginning to convince myself that whatever had been out there had moved on, I heard a new sound that sent electric terror coursing through my nervous system. The soft scrape of something being dragged across rocky ground. The sound was coming from the direction of Kevin and Heather's tent. My blood pressure spiked as I imagined the worst. Someone dragging away my friends while they slept, pulling them into the forest where their screams wouldn't carry beyond the trees. I had to resist the overwhelming urge to leap from my truck and rush to their aid, knowing that would likely result in my own capture or worse. Instead, I forced myself to remain still and observe. The dragging sound continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped. In the faint glow of the ember-lit campsite, I could see that Kevin and Heather's tent appeared undisturbed, its familiar blue dome shape intact and unmoving. The relief was short-lived, however, as I realized the sound was now coming from a different location entirely. Something was being systematically moved around our campsite. Equipment, perhaps, or supplies. Someone was going through our things with the same methodical approach they'd used to circle our camp. The violation felt deeply personal, as if invisible hands were rifling through not just our belongings, but our sense of safety and security. The activity continued for another 10 minutes, always just beyond my range of vision. I could hear the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet clank of metal against metal, the whisper of objects being shifted and rearranged. All of it was being done with remarkable care to minimize noise, but the absolute silence of the surrounding forest amplified every sound into something ominous and threatening. Then I heard the sound that nearly made me lose control entirely. The soft, distinctive zip of a tent being opened. My friends were seasoned campers who would never leave their tents unzipped in bear country. Someone was entering one of the tents, and the occupants were either unconscious or already gone. I gripped my pistol so tightly my knuckles went white, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to charge into the darkness and confront whatever was threatening my friends. But then I heard Kevin's voice, muffled but unmistakably his, mumbling something incoherent in his sleep. Heather made a small sound of acknowledgement, the kind partners make when disturbed but not awakened. They were alive and unharmed, which meant someone had opened their tent from outside and was now... what? Watching them sleep? Searching their belongings? Planning something worse? The tent zip closed again with the same careful precision. I watched the familiar dome shape, waiting for any sign of movement from within, any indication that my friends were aware of what had just happened. But the tent remained still and silent, its occupants apparently undisturbed by the violation that had just occurred. Now the activity moved to Brian's tent 20 feet away. Again, the careful approach, the soft zip of the entrance being opened, the pause that could mean anything or nothing. I wanted to scream a warning, to honk my horn and wake everyone, but some primitive survival instinct kept me frozen in place. I had become a witness to something that defied rational explanation, and my rational mind was struggling to process what my senses were telling me. Brian's tent was sealed again, and the unseen intruders moved on to Tony's setup. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Approach, open, pause, close, move on. Each violation felt like a physical blow, a reminder of how helpless I was to protect my friends from this invisible threat. When they finished with Tony's tent, the activity stopped entirely. The silence stretched on, more oppressive than any sound. I waited, barely breathing, for some indication of what would happen next. Had they found what they were looking for? Were they preparing to take more direct action? Or were they simply content to demonstrate their power over us, to prove that we were completely at their mercy? Minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. My legs began to cramp from remaining motionless for so long, but I didn't dare shift position for fear of drawing attention. My eyes had adapted to the darkness as much as they ever would, but the forest beyond our campsite remained an impenetrable wall of shadow. They could be watching me right now, I realized, observing my fear and confusion with whatever twisted satisfaction motivated their actions. That's when I saw the first one. It emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees about 30 yards from the fire, moving with fluid grace that suggested complete familiarity with the terrain. In the dim glow of the dying embers, I could make out a human silhouette, but something about its proportions seemed wrong, distorted in a way that made my skin crawl. As my eyes adjusted and focused, the details became clearer and infinitely more terrifying. The figure was wearing some kind of robe or cloak that hung in loose folds around its body, obscuring its true shape and size, but it was the head that sent pure terror crashing through my system like ice water in my veins. Where a human face should have been, there was the bleached white skull of a deer, complete with an impressive rack of antlers that caught the faint firelight and threw twisted shadows across the surrounding trees. The empty eye sockets seemed to stare directly at me through the darkness, as if the wearer could see perfectly despite the lack of natural vision. The figure stood perfectly motionless for what felt like an eternity, its skull face turned in my direction. I couldn't tell if it was looking at me specifically or simply scanning the campsite. But every instinct screamed that I was being evaluated, measured, judged by some incomprehensible standard. Then it raised one arm, slowly, deliberately, and pointed directly at my truck. The pointing gesture lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime of exposure under that eyeless gaze. When the figure finally lowered its arm, it didn't retreat back into the forest as I desperately hoped it would. Instead, it began to move along the perimeter of our campsite, maintaining that same measured pace I'd heard earlier. Now, I could match the sound to the source, watching as each step was placed with calculated precision. What made the sight even more disturbing was the complete silence of its movement. Despite the dry pine needles and brittle undergrowth that carpeted the forest floor, the figure's feet made almost no sound. It moved like a ghost, like something that had learned to exist between the spaces where normal sounds occurred. As it continued its circuit around our camp, I noticed other details that added layers to my growing terror. The robe appeared to be made of some kind of rough, dark fabric that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The deer skull was mounted perfectly on what I assumed was a human head, held in place by leather straps that were barely visible in the dim light. Most unsettling of all, the antlers were not the clean, natural bone of a shed rack, but appeared to have been taken from a recently killed animal, still bearing traces of velvet and dried blood. The figure completed one full circuit of our campsite, then stopped directly between my truck and the cluster of tents where my friends slept in blissful ignorance. It stood there for several minutes, perfectly motionless except for the slight sway of its robes in the night breeze. I found myself holding my breath, terrified that even the sound of my breathing might provoke some kind of response. Then, without warning, it tilted its skull-crowned head back and released a sound that still haunts my nightmares. It wasn't quite a howl, not exactly a scream, but something that combined elements of both with harmonics that seemed designed to trigger primal fear responses. The sound rolled across the landscape like a wave, echoing off the surrounding ridges and seeming to come from everywhere at once. The effect on the local wildlife was immediate and profound. Every bird within a mile radius fell silent. The constant background chorus of insects that had been barely noticeable suddenly ceased entirely. Even the wind seemed to die away, leaving the forest in a state of absolute, unnatural quiet that pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight. But the most terrifying part was what happened next. From multiple locations around our campsite, the call was answered. The responses came from at least 4 different directions, maybe more. Each voice was slightly different, some higher, some lower, some with an almost musical quality that made them even more disturbing than the original call. But they were all unmistakably similar, all carrying that same undertone of barely contained menace that spoke to something deep and primitive in my lizard brain. As the last echo of the calls faded away, I saw them begin to emerge from the forest. They came from the north first, 2 figures moving in perfect synchronization, their matching deer skull masks turned toward our campsite. These wore the same dark robes as the first, but I could see variations in their antler configurations. One bore the massive rack of what must have been an elk, while the other wore the more modest but still imposing skull of a white-tailed deer. From the east came another pair, and these were even more disturbing in their appearance. Instead of deer skulls, they wore the elongated skulls of what looked like wolves or coyotes, the empty eye sockets somehow even more menacing than those of their cervine counterparts. Their robes were slightly different as well, adorned with what appeared to be bones or teeth woven into the fabric in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The south brought a single figure, but this one was clearly different from the others. Taller, broader, moving with an authority that marked it as some kind of leader. Its skull mask was unlike anything I'd ever seen, possibly a bear, but modified and decorated in ways that transformed it into something entirely other. Painted symbols covered the bone surface, glowing faintly with some kind of phosphorescent material that made them visible even in the darkness. From the west came the largest group, at least 4 figures, possibly more. Their skulls were a mixture of species I couldn't identify, creating a nightmare parade of empty sockets and gleaming bone. Some had antlers, others had horns, and at least one appeared to be wearing the skull of some kind of large bird, its beak pointing forward like an accusatory finger. As they completed their emergence from the forest, I realized with growing horror that we were completely surrounded. At least 10 figures now stood at the perimeter of our campsite, forming a rough circle that enclosed my sleeping friends and my increasingly inadequate truck. They maintained their positions with military precision, each one perfectly spaced from the others, creating an unbroken ring of watchers. The leader, the one with the bear skull, raised both arms above its head. In response, the others began to move inward, closing the circle with slow, synchronized steps. They maintained their spacing perfectly, like dancers following a choreographed routine they'd performed countless times before. As they drew closer, I could make out more details that added to the surreal horror of the scene. Their robes weren't uniform. Some were black, others dark brown or deep red. Many were decorated with additional bones, feathers, or other objects that clinked softly as they moved. Several carried items in their hands, staffs topped with more skulls, bundles of what looked like dried herbs, objects whose purpose I couldn't begin to guess. The smell reached me when they were about 20 yards away from my truck. It was a complex odor that layered rotting vegetation, wood smoke, and something else. Something organic and disturbing that made my stomach clench with nausea. It was the smell of death, of things that should have been buried long ago but instead had been left to decompose in secret places far from human civilization. They stopped their advance when they were approximately 15 yards from the outer edge of our campsite, forming a tight circle that encompassed our entire area. Each figure stood perfectly still, their skull faces turned inward toward our camp. The collective weight of their attention was almost unbearable, like being examined by a tribunal of judges whose criteria for judgment existed in realms beyond human understanding. What happened next defied every expectation I might have had about such an encounter. Instead of attacking, instead of making demands or threats, they simply stood there and watched. Minutes passed in absolute silence, the only movement the gentle sway of their robes in the night breeze. They seemed content to observe, to study us like specimens in some twisted scientific experiment. The psychological pressure was immense. Every second that passed without action felt like a buildup toward something worse, like the pause before a thunderclap. I found myself almost wishing they would do something, anything, rather than continue this silent, menacing observation. The waiting was its own form of torture, designed to break down rational thought and replace it with pure animal panic. My friends remained asleep, somehow undisturbed by the supernatural stillness that had fallen over the forest. I envied their ignorance while simultaneously fearing for their safety. How could they not sense the danger that surrounded us? How could they sleep through the weight of so many watching eyes? I checked my phone again. Still no signal, of course. Even if I could have called for help, what would I have said? That we were surrounded by people in animal skull masks who hadn't actually done anything threatening yet. The local sheriff would think I was having some kind of breakdown, assuming he could even reach us in this remote location. My hand found the truck's ignition key, and I slowly, carefully turned it enough to activate the electrical system without starting the engine. The dashboard lights came on, seeming blindingly bright after so much darkness. I immediately dimmed them to their lowest setting, but not before I caught a glimpse of movement from the watching figures. Several had shifted their positions slightly, angling their skull faces toward the source of the light. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, enough to get us out of here if I could somehow get everyone into the truck quickly enough. But the logistics were daunting. The tents were positioned around the campsite in a rough semicircle, each one requiring precious seconds to reach and more time to evacuate. The watchers could easily prevent any escape attempt simply by moving to block our path to freedom. As if reading my thoughts, the leader raised one hand and made a gesture I couldn't interpret. In response, several of the other figures began to move again, but not toward us. Instead, they repositioned themselves to block the dirt road that provided our only vehicle access to and from the campsite. Our route of escape was now effectively sealed. The message was clear. We weren't leaving until they decided we could leave. The realization that we were now prisoners transformed my fear into something approaching panic. My heart rate spiked, and I had to fight to control my breathing. The truck suddenly felt less like protection and more like a trap, its metal walls inadequate against the unknown capabilities of our captors. But then something unexpected happened. The leader lowered its arms and took a step backward, away from our campsite. Following its lead, the other figures also began to retreat, slowly expanding their circle until they were once again positioned at the forest's edge. They maintained their watch, but the immediate sense of physical threat diminished slightly. It was then that I understood the true nature of our situation. This wasn't a prelude to violence, it was a demonstration of power. They wanted us to know that we were completely at their mercy, that our lives continued only because they chose to allow it. We were being toyed with, manipulated by intelligences that operated according to rules we couldn't comprehend. The psychological warfare was masterful in its simplicity. By surrounding us and then withdrawing, by demonstrating their ability to control our movements without actually harming us, they had achieved something far more effective than simple violence. They had planted seeds of terror that would grow and flourish long after this night ended, assuming we lived to see morning. As the figures settled into their new positions, I realized that this was likely just the beginning. They had shown us their numbers and their organization. They had proved their ability to move through the forest with supernatural stealth. They had demonstrated their control over the situation. Now they were waiting to see what we would do next. The standoff continued for another 20 minutes, though time had lost all meaningful measurement in that suspended reality of terror and uncertainty. The figures maintained their watch from the forest's edge, occasionally shifting position, but never breaking their circle of surveillance. I remained frozen in my truck, torn between the desperate need to warn my friends and the equally desperate fear of triggering some escalation in the situation. The decision was taken out of my hands when Kevin emerged from his tent. He moved with the sluggish confusion of someone awakened by a full bladder in the middle of the night, completely unaware of the nightmare that surrounded our campsite. I watched in horror as he stumbled toward the tree line, his flashlight beam dancing weakly across the ground in front of him. He was walking directly toward one of the watchers. I had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that could determine whether my friend lived or died. Every instinct screamed at me to start the truck, lean on the horn, and wake everyone up immediately. But a deeper, more primitive part of my brain warned that sudden noise or movement might provoke exactly the kind of response we needed to avoid. Instead, I took the middle path that felt like cowardice, even as I enacted it. I rolled down my window and called out in a voice that was intended to be casual, but came out strangled with suppressed panic. "Kevin, wait up. I'll come with you." The sound of my voice in that unnatural silence seemed to boom across the landscape like a gunshot. Kevin stopped mid-stride and turned toward my truck, his flashlight beam sweeping across the campsite. For a moment, I thought he might actually see the watchers, but his light was too weak, and his eyes too adjusted to darkness to penetrate the shadows where they stood. "You awake too?" he called back, his voice carrying the slightly slurred cadence of interrupted sleep. Thought I heard something earlier, but I figured it was just the usual forest sounds. I climbed out of my truck with movements that felt exaggerated and unnatural, hyper-aware that every gesture was being observed and evaluated by unknown judges. My bear spray and pistol remained within easy reach, but I tried to move with casual normalcy that wouldn't alarm either my friend or our watchers. "Yeah, couldn't sleep," I replied, walking toward Kevin with steps that felt like I was moving through quicksand. Figured I'd take a walk around the perimeter, make sure everything's secure. As I approached Kevin, I could see the watchers more clearly in my peripheral vision. They remained motionless, but their skull faces tracked my movement with the patient attention of predators evaluating prey. The closest one was perhaps 20 feet away, close enough that I could make out individual details of its deer skull mask, including what appeared to be carved symbols etched into the bone around the eye sockets. Kevin seemed oblivious to the danger, but I noticed that his hand was unconsciously gripping his flashlight like a weapon. Some part of his subconscious had registered the wrongness of the situation, even if his rational mind hadn't yet processed the threat. "It's weird out here tonight," he said quietly as I reached his side. "Too quiet, you know? Usually there's at least some wildlife noise, but it's like everything just stopped." "I noticed that too," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady while my eyes constantly scanned the tree line. "Maybe we should wake the others and think about packing up early." Kevin frowned, finally giving me his full attention. In the dim glow of his flashlight, I could see confusion and growing concern in his expression. He was beginning to pick up on the undercurrents of fear that I was radiating despite my best efforts at concealment. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony of his word choice would have been funny under different circumstances. Instead, it highlighted just how inadequate normal language was for describing our situation. How could I possibly explain that we were surrounded by figures in animal skull masks without sounding completely insane? Before I could formulate an answer, Heather's voice called out from their tent. "Kevin, everything okay out there?" The sound of her voice seemed to trigger something in our watchers. I caught subtle movements from multiple positions around the perimeter, heads turning, positions shifting, a general increase in attention that suggested our time of passive observation might be coming to an end. "Fine, babe," Kevin called back. "Just needed some air. We'll be back in a minute." But we wouldn't have a minute, I realized. The situation was escalating beyond my ability to control or contain it. More of my friends were waking up, drawn by the sound of voices and the instinctive recognition that something was amiss. I could hear rustling from the other tents as people began to stir. That's when the leader made its move. The figure with the bear skull stepped forward from the tree line, no longer making any attempt at concealment. It moved with deliberate purpose, covering the distance between the forest and our campsite in long, measured strides that spoke of complete confidence in its control of the situation. Kevin saw it immediately. His flashlight beam swung toward the approaching figure, and the small circle of light illuminated a vision that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. The bear skull mask was even more terrifying up close, its empty eye sockets seeming to swallow light rather than reflect it. The painted symbols covering its surface writhed and shifted in the moving flashlight beam, creating an optical illusion that made them appear to be alive. Kevin's reaction was immediate and visceral. He stumbled backward, his flashlight beam jerking wildly as his hands began to shake. A strangled sound escaped his throat, not quite a scream, but close enough to wake everyone else in the camp if they weren't already stirring. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice high and tight with panic. The leader stopped approximately 10 feet away from us, well within the range where it could reach us in a single leap if it chose to attack. But instead of aggression, it displayed something far more unsettling: patience. It stood perfectly still and simply watched us, its skull face tilted slightly to one side in what might have been curiosity or amusement. That's when I heard the zippers. All around our campsite, tent flaps were being opened as my friends responded to the disturbance. Heather emerged from her tent first, followed quickly by Brian and Tony. They stumbled into a nightmare that their minds couldn't immediately process, their flashlight beams revealing the full horror of our situation. We were surrounded by at least 12 figures now, possibly more hidden in the deeper shadows. Each one stood perfectly motionless except for the slight sway of their robes, creating a ring of silent watchers that enclosed our campsite like a nightmare version of a fairy ring. The skull masks caught and reflected our flashlight beams, creating a strobe effect of empty eye sockets and gleaming bone. Heather screamed. It was a sound of pure, primal terror that echoed across the landscape and seemed to hang in the air long after her breath ran out. The sound triggered something in our watchers, a subtle shift in posture, a collective turning of skull faces toward the source of the scream, a sense of increased attention that made my skin crawl. "Everyone stay calm," I said loudly, though my own voice was shaking. "Nobody make any sudden movements." But chaos was already taking hold. Brian had stumbled backward toward his tent, his flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the ring of watchers. Tony was fumbling for something in his equipment bag, probably his own weapon, though I prayed he wouldn't be stupid enough to try using it. Kevin had grabbed Heather and was pulling her toward the truck, both of them stumbling over guy lines and camping equipment in their panic. The leader watched all of this with what I could only interpret as satisfaction. The panic, the chaos, the breakdown of rational thought. This was exactly what it had wanted to achieve. We were dancing to its tune, responding to its orchestration of fear with exactly the kind of helpless terror it had anticipated. That's when I realized the true purpose of this encounter. This wasn't random violence or robbery. This was psychological warfare conducted with surgical precision. They had studied us, learned our routines, waited for the perfect moment to demonstrate their power. We weren't victims of circumstance. We were subjects in some kind of experiment. The thought filled me with rage that temporarily overcame my fear. These things, whatever they were, had turned our sanctuary into a laboratory, our weekend retreat into a testing ground for their twisted games. The violation felt even more personal than the theft of my camping gear. But rage wouldn't save us. Only careful thought and decisive action could get us out of this alive. I caught Kevin's eye and gestured toward my truck. "Everyone get to the vehicle," I said clearly. "Move slowly, stay together, don't run." The leader's skull face turned toward me as I spoke, and I had the distinct impression that it was evaluating my attempt to take control of the situation. For a moment, I thought it might intervene, might step forward to block our path or signal its companions to prevent our escape. Instead, it did something that chilled me more than any threat could have. It stepped aside. The gesture was unmistakable. It was giving us permission to leave, allowing us to retreat to the false security of my truck. But the permission came with an implicit understanding that we existed at its sufferance, that our lives continued only because it chose to allow them to continue. We moved as a group toward my truck, our flashlights creating a small pool of light in the surrounding darkness. The watchers shifted position as we moved, maintaining their circle but adjusting their spacing to accommodate our movement. They were herding us, I realized, guiding us toward exactly where they wanted us to be. When we reached my truck, I fumbled with my keys while my friends piled into the bed and cab with desperate urgency. Heather was sobbing quietly, her face buried against Kevin's shoulder. Brian and Tony flanked them, their own weapons now visible as they prepared for a fight they couldn't possibly win. The truck started on the first try, its engine roaring to life with sound that seemed impossibly loud in that supernatural silence. I threw it into reverse and began backing toward the dirt road that would take us away from this nightmare, my headlights sweeping across the ring of watchers as we moved. That's when they began to close in. The moment my truck began moving, everything changed. The passive observation transformed into active pursuit as the watchers abandoned their static positions and began converging on our location. They moved with fluid coordination that spoke of extensive practice, each figure taking a position that would maximize their collective ability to control our escape route. My headlights swept across skull faces and flowing robes as I reversed toward the dirt road, creating a strobing nightmare of bone and shadow. In the truck bed, Brian and Tony had their weapons ready, though I could see the hopelessness in their faces as they counted the odds. 12 against 5, in terrain that our pursuers knew intimately while we could barely see beyond the range of our headlights. The leader was the first to break into actual pursuit, its bear skull mask bobbing with each stride as it moved to intercept our path. But instead of running, it maintained that same measured pace I'd observed earlier, confident, unhurried, as if it knew exactly how this chase would end. "Drive faster!" Kevin shouted from the passenger seat, but I was already pushing the truck to its limits on the narrow, rutted road. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and we'd be stuck in a ditch with nowhere to run and no hope of rescue. Behind us, the watchers had spread out across the road, ensuring that any attempt to reverse direction would be blocked. Ahead, I could see movement in the trees that lined our escape route, more figures positioning themselves to control our forward progress. We were being funneled into a trap whose dimensions I couldn't yet perceive. The first attack came from the right side of the road, where 3 watchers emerged from the tree line and began running alongside the truck. These moved differently from the others, faster, more aggressively, with an animal fluidity that suggested they were accustomed to this kind of pursuit. Their skull masks included what appeared to be canine specimens, wolf or coyote skulls that seemed appropriate for pack hunters. One of them threw something at my truck, a rock that struck the passenger side window with enough force to spider the glass. Heather screamed again, a sound that seemed to encourage the attackers. More projectiles followed. Rocks, sticks, what might have been bones collected from forest kills. Most missed, but several struck the truck bed where Brian and Tony were forced to duck for cover. "They're trying to disable the vehicle," Tony called out, his ranger training allowing him to maintain some analytical thinking despite the chaos. "If they can break the windshield or damage the tires, we're done." As if summoned by his words, another group of watchers appeared ahead of us, positioned directly in the middle of the road. These stood their ground as I approached, their skull faces turned toward our headlights with what I could only interpret as challenge. I had perhaps 3 seconds to decide whether to attempt to drive through them or swerve into the forest. I chose to maintain course, pressing the accelerator to the floor and hoping that their nerve would break before mine did. The engine roared as we approached the roadblock at nearly 40 miles per hour, our headlights illuminating details I wished I couldn't see. The skull masks were decorated with intricate carvings and paintings that seemed to shift and writhe in the harsh light. Bone ornaments and feathers hung from their robes, creating a percussion section that accompanied their movements with soft clicks and rustles. At the last possible moment, they scattered, not in panic, but with the fluid coordination of dancers completing a rehearsed routine. We shot through the gap they left behind, close enough that I could smell that nauseating combination of decay and smoke that seemed to cling to all of them. But the roadblock had served its purpose by forcing me to slow down and choose a predictable path. As we cleared the immediate obstacle, I saw movement in my mirrors that made my blood freeze. More watchers were emerging from the forest behind us, at least 6 or 7 additional figures that brought their total numbers to nearly 20. We weren't being chased by a small group of cultists or disturbed individuals. This was a coordinated operation involving enough people to populate a small town. The implications were staggering. How many of them were there? How long had they been operating in this area? How many other campers and hikers had encountered them in these remote locations? The dirt road began to wind down the mountainside in a series of switchbacks that required me to reduce speed significantly. Each turn presented an opportunity for ambush. Each straight section offered clear lines of sight for anyone positioned to attack us. My hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel, and sweat was making it difficult to maintain control as we navigated the treacherous route. That's when I heard the sound that nearly caused me to lose control entirely. The deep, resonant howl of what could only be a large dog or wolf. The sound came from somewhere ahead of us, echoing off the canyon walls and seeming to originate from multiple directions simultaneously. "They have animals," Brian said quietly, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Dogs, maybe wolves, trained to hunt." The howl was answered by another, then another, until a chorus of predatory voices filled the night air around us. The sounds were coming from both sides of the road now, pacing our progress and coordinating their positions with pack intelligence that made human pursuit seem simple by comparison. In the passenger seat, Kevin was trying to get cell phone service, holding his device toward the window and watching the signal indicator with desperate attention. "Nothing," he reported. "We're still too far back in the mountains." That's when the first animal appeared in our headlights. It wasn't a wolf or domestic dog, but something that combined characteristics of both into a creature that seemed designed by Nightmare. Larger than any dog I'd ever seen, with proportions that suggested selective breeding for size and aggression. Its fur was dark, almost black, and its eyes reflected our headlights with an unnatural intensity that spoke of intelligence and malevolent purpose. The creature positioned itself in the middle of the road and held its ground as we approached. Its lips pulled back to reveal teeth that gleamed white in our headlights. Unlike the watchers, it showed no inclination to move aside at the last moment. This was a game of chicken with stakes that could only end in violence. I made the decision to swerve, steering the truck onto the narrow shoulder rather than risk a collision that could disable our vehicle. The maneuver worked, but it cost us precious speed and control as we fought to regain traction on the loose gravel and exposed rock. More animals appeared from the forest, at least 4 that I could see, possibly more hidden in the shadows beyond our headlights. They moved with pack coordination, flanking our vehicle and matching our speed with the effortless endurance of creatures bred for the hunt. Every few seconds, one would dart closer to the truck, snapping at the tires or jumping toward the bed where my friends crouched in defensive positions. Tony had his pistol drawn, but he was holding fire, probably recognizing that muzzle flashes would destroy our night vision and that the sound of gunshots might provoke an all-out attack from the animals. Brian had armed himself with a camping axe, a weapon that would be effective in close quarters but useless against the coordinated assault we were facing. The road began to level out as we approached the main highway, raising hopes that we might actually escape this nightmare. But those hopes were crushed when I saw the roadblock ahead. 3 vehicles were positioned across the dirt road where it intersected with the paved highway, 2 pickup trucks, and what appeared to be an old van, all arranged to create an impassable barrier. Figures in skull masks stood beside the vehicles, watching our approach with that same patient attention I'd come to associate with absolute confidence in the outcome. We were trapped. Behind us, the Watchers and their animals were closing in. Ahead, an organized roadblock waited to complete our capture. The forest on either side was too dense and steep to attempt an escape on foot, and even if we tried, we'd be running directly into terrain that our pursuers knew intimately while we stumbled blind through unfamiliar wilderness. I brought the truck to a stop about 50 yards from the roadblock, my engine idling as I tried to process our options. In the sudden quiet, I could hear the animals moving through the forest around us, their presence marked by the soft sound of paws on pine needles and the occasional low growl that seemed designed to maintain psychological pressure. "What do we do now?" Heather whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. Before I could answer, the leader with the bear skull mask emerged from the forest beside the road. It walked with that same unhurried confidence, approaching my driver's side window with movements that suggested complete control of the situation. When it reached the truck, it stood there for a moment, its empty eye sockets somehow conveying more menace than any living eyes could have managed. Then it raised one hand and tapped gently on the glass. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it carried implications that made my skin crawl. This wasn't a demand or a threat, it was an invitation. They wanted us to voluntarily participate in whatever came next, to become willing subjects in their twisted experiment rather than simply victims of violence. I looked at my friends, seeing my own terror reflected in their faces. Kevin had his arm around Heather, who was shaking with barely controlled sobs. Brian and Tony maintained their defensive positions in the truck bed, but I could see the hopelessness in their postures. We all understood that our situation had moved beyond any possibility of conventional escape. The leader tapped on the window again, more insistently this time. Around us, the other Watchers began to close in, maintaining their circle but reducing its diameter with each step. The animals moved with them, creating a secondary perimeter that eliminated any possibility of flight. I had to make a choice that could determine whether we lived or died. I could try to ram through the roadblock, hoping that the vehicles weren't as immovable as they appeared, and that we could break through before the animals could disable our truck. I could attempt to negotiate, though what we might have to offer beings who operated by such alien logic was impossible to imagine. Or I could roll down the window and find out what they wanted. My hand trembled as I reached for the window control, every instinct screaming against voluntarily reducing the barrier between us and the nightmare that surrounded our truck. But I could see no other option that didn't end with immediate violence, and violence against these odds would mean certain death for all of us. The window descended with a soft mechanical whir that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The night air that flowed into the truck carried that same disturbing smell I'd noticed earlier. Decay and smoke, mixed with something else that I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach clench with nausea. The leader stepped closer to the window, close enough that I could see every detail of its horrifying mask. The bear skull had been modified and decorated with intricate care that spoke of religious or ritualistic significance. Symbols were carved into the bone around the eye sockets and across the snout, filled with what appeared to be some kind of luminescent paint that made them glow with a sickly green light. Feathers and small bones hung from leather strips attached to the back of the skull, creating a subtle percussion that accompanied every movement of its head. For several seconds, we simply stared at each other, or rather, I stared, while it observed me through those empty sockets that seemed to see far more than any living eyes should be able to perceive. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications and unspoken threats. When it finally spoke, its voice was a shock that nearly caused me to lose control of my bodily functions. The sound was distinctly human. Male, I thought, with a slight accent that I couldn't place, but filtered through the skull mask in a way that gave it an otherworldly resonance. More disturbing was the fact that it spoke in perfectly normal English, destroying any hope I might have harbored that these were simply disturbed individuals engaged in some kind of elaborate prank. "You have trespassed in sacred places," it said, the words emerging from the skull's mouth with unnatural clarity. "You have disturbed things that should remain at rest." I found my voice after several attempts, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We didn't know. We're just camping. We'll leave and never come back." The skull face tilted slightly to one side, and I had the impression that my response had been anticipated and found lacking. Around us, the other watchers maintained their positions, but I could sense increased attention, as if my words had triggered some kind of evaluation process. "Knowledge is not required for transgression," the leader continued. "The mountain knows its own. The forest remembers what has been forgotten. You carry the scent of violation." The words made no logical sense, but they were delivered with such conviction that I found myself wondering if there was some truth hidden in their apparent madness. Had we unknowingly committed some offense against whatever twisted theology these people followed? Or was this simply the ritualistic preamble to violence that had been predetermined from the moment we'd entered their territory? Kevin leaned forward from the passenger seat, his voice shaky but determined. "Look, we don't want any trouble. Just tell us what you want, and we'll try to make it right." The leader's attention shifted to Kevin, and I saw my friend recoil slightly from the weight of that eyeless gaze. Several of the other watchers moved closer to the truck, their own skull faces turning toward us with predatory interest. "What we want," the leader said slowly, "is for the balance to be restored, for the debt to be paid, for the circle to be completed." The cryptic language was clearly deliberate, designed to confuse and intimidate us while revealing nothing about their actual intentions. But I caught something in the tone, an undercurrent that suggested these weren't simply the ravings of madmen. There was structure here, purpose, a systematic approach that spoke of organized beliefs and careful planning. "What debt?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "What are you talking about?" The leader raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed directly at me. "You were here before. You marked yourself. You opened the door." Ice water flooded my veins as I realized what it was referring to. My missing camping gear, the methodical way everything had been removed without leaving any trace. They hadn't simply stolen my equipment. They'd been studying it, examining it, using it to identify me as some kind of target. But why? What had I done to draw their attention? I'd been camping in these mountains for years without incident, following all the established protocols for wilderness safety and environmental protection. I paid my permits, followed leave no trace principles, and respected both the natural environment and other visitors. Unless... The thought struck me with the force of revelation. 2 years ago, during our hunting trip when we'd first discovered this campsite, we'd found something unusual. A stone formation that looked almost like an altar, surrounded by objects that didn't belong in the natural environment: carved bones, bundled herbs, arrangements of stones that suggested human activity. We'd assumed it was some kind of historical site, possibly related to Native American ceremonies, and had carefully avoided disturbing it. But we'd photographed it. I remembered Kevin taking pictures with his phone, documenting what we'd thought was an interesting archaeological discovery. We'd even discussed reporting it to the Forest Service, though we'd ultimately decided against it to avoid drawing attention to our secret camping spot. "The photographs," I said quietly, understanding flooding through me like poison. You're talking about the photographs. The leader's skull face dipped in what might have been a nod of acknowledgement. Around us, the other watchers shifted position, creating a subtle but unmistakable tightening of their circle. The animals moved with them, low growls indicating their readiness to attack on command. Images steal the spirit, the leader said. Capture the essence, bind the sacred to the profane. Your magic box has committed theft of the highest order. Magic box. They were talking about Kevin's phone. In their twisted worldview, photographing their ritual site had constituted some kind of spiritual crime that demanded retribution. The fact that we'd never even developed or shared the pictures was apparently irrelevant to whatever justice they intended to dispense. Kevin was staring at me with growing comprehension and horror. He understood now why we'd been targeted, why his girlfriend and friends were caught up in this nightmare. A simple act of documentation, something we'd done without malicious intent, had marked us for whatever these people considered appropriate punishment. "Delete them," Kevin said quickly, fumbling for his phone. "I'll delete the pictures right now. You can watch me do it." But the leader was already shaking its skull-crowned head. "The damage is complete. The sacred has been profaned. The balance requires restoration through sacrifice." The word sacrifice hung in the air like a death sentence, removing any lingering hope that this might end with negotiation or compromise. These people operated according to a logic that existed outside normal human understanding, following rules that made violence not just possible, but necessary. That's when Tony made his move. From the truck bed, I heard the distinctive sound of a pistol being cocked, followed immediately by Tony's voice raised in desperate authority. "Everyone back off. Now, I'm a federal employee, and if you don't disperse immediately, you'll be facing federal charges." The effect of his words was immediate and catastrophic. The watchers responded to the threat with fluid coordination that transformed them from passive observers into active predators. They didn't flee or show any sign of intimidation. Instead, they moved to surround the truck completely, eliminating any possibility of escape while maintaining positions that would allow them to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The animals reacted even more dramatically, their low growls escalating into snarls of barely contained aggression. I could see at least 6 of them now, positioned around the truck like pieces on a chessboard, waiting for the command to attack. The leader turned its attention to Tony, and when it spoke again, its voice carried a note of amusement that was more terrifying than any threat could have been. "Federal employee," it repeated, as if tasting the words. "The government that promises protection while permitting desecration. The authority that claims dominion over lands it has never understood. Tell me, federal employee, what protection does your badge provide against the justice of the mountain?" Tony's response was to raise his weapon, pointing it directly at the leader's skull-masked head. "I'm warning you, back off, or I'll shoot." The leader stood perfectly still, making no attempt to avoid the weapon's aim. Around us, the other watchers maintained their positions with similar calm, as if the threat of violence was simply irrelevant to their calculations. "Your weapon fires lead," the leader said conversationally. Lead, that came from these mountains, extracted by machines that scarred the earth and poisoned the water. You would defend violation with the fruits of violation, compound sacrilege with sacrilege. The mountain remembers every wound, federal employee. Every scar carries a debt that must eventually be paid. The philosophical lecture was interrupted by the sound of Heather sobbing in the passenger seat, her fear finally overwhelming her ability to remain silent. The sound seemed to trigger something in our captors, a subtle shift in attention that suggested the psychological pressure was approaching its intended climax. "Enough," the leader said firmly. "The time for words has passed. The debt will be collected. The balance will be restored." It raised both hands above its skull-crowned head, and immediately the other watchers began to close in from all directions. Their movement was synchronized and inevitable, like the closing of a trap that had been carefully constructed over months or years of planning. This was it, the moment when our situation would be resolved through violence, one way or another. Tony had his weapon raised, Brian was gripping his axe, and I had my own pistol within reach. But against these odds, in terrain that favored our attackers, our chances of survival were essentially zero. That's when I made the decision that saved our lives, though it cost us something far more precious than money or possessions. I turned off the truck's engine. The sudden silence when the engine died was absolute and devastating. Without the mechanical noise to mask the sounds of our breathing, our heartbeats, our barely controlled panic, we were exposed in a way that felt almost physical. The watchers continued their approach, but now I could hear every footstep, every rustle of fabric, every soft command passed between them in a language I didn't recognize. "What are you doing?" Kevin hissed, his voice tight with terror. "Start the truck." But I kept my hands away from the ignition, knowing that any attempt to restart the engine would be interpreted as preparation for escape and would trigger the final assault. Instead, I rolled the window down completely and leaned out toward the leader, making myself as vulnerable and non-threatening as possible. "Wait," I called out, hoping my voice would carry over the sound of approaching footsteps. "I want to make a deal." The leader raised one hand, and immediately the other watchers stopped their advance. They maintained their positions in a tight circle around our truck, close enough now that I could see individual details of their various skull masks and the intricate decorations that adorned their robes. Some carried staffs or other ritual objects, while others had their hands free but positioned in ways that suggested readiness for violence. "What bargain would you offer?" the leader asked. "That could balance the scales of your transgression." This was the crucial moment, the point where I had to demonstrate understanding of their twisted logic while offering something they would value more than our lives. I thought frantically about everything I'd observed, every clue they'd provided about their motivations and beliefs. "The photographs are just copies," I said carefully. "Images captured by technology you don't recognize as legitimate. But the original sacred site remains intact. We never disturbed it, never took anything physical from it. The true violation isn't what we've done, it's what we might do in the future." The skull face tilted slightly, and I sensed I had the leader's attention. Around us, the other watchers remained motionless, but I could feel the weight of their collective focus as they evaluated my words. "If you kill us," I continued, "others will come looking. Search and rescue teams, law enforcement, federal investigators. They'll bring more people, more technology, more disruption to your sacred places than a few photographs ever could. But if you let us go, we become your protection instead of your problem." It was a desperate gambit, but I could see in the leader's posture that my words were having an effect. The slight forward lean of its skull-crowned head suggested interest, or at least a willingness to hear more of my proposal. "Explain," it said simply. "We know where your sacred site is located," I said, my voice gaining strength as I developed the logic of my argument. "We can make sure no one else finds it. We can redirect other campers away from this area, report dangerous conditions or wildlife hazards that will keep people from exploring too deeply. We can be your early warning system against future violations." The leader considered this for several long moments, its empty eye sockets seeming to peer directly into my soul. Around us, the forest held its breath. No sound from animals, no movement of wind through the trees, as if the natural world itself was waiting for the decision that would determine our fate. "And the photographs?" it asked finally. Kevin immediately began fumbling with his phone, his hands shaking as he navigated to the camera gallery. "I'll delete them right now," he said. "Every single one. You can watch me do it." But the leader raised a hand to stop him. "Deletion is not sufficient. The images must be purified, the spiritual contamination cleansed through proper ritual. The device itself must be sanctified." I felt my heart sink as I realized what it was asking. These people weren't interested in simple deletion. They wanted Kevin's phone, probably to destroy it in whatever ceremony they used to address spiritual violations. For Kevin, that phone represented thousands of photos, contacts, and personal information that would be impossible to replace. But the alternative was death for all of us. "Okay," I said before Kevin could object. "Take the phone. Purify it however you need to. In exchange, you let us go and we never speak about any of this to anyone." Kevin started to protest, but I cut him off with a sharp look. Material possessions, no matter how valuable or irreplaceable, were meaningless compared to our lives. He seemed to understand this, though I could see the pain in his eyes as he contemplated losing years of memories stored in that device. The leader extended one robed hand toward Kevin's window. "The device," it said simply. Kevin looked at the phone in his hands, then at his girlfriend sobbing beside him, then at the ring of skull-faced watchers who surrounded our truck. With visible reluctance, he placed the phone in the leader's outstretched palm. The moment the device changed hands, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere around us. The oppressive weight of impending violence lifted slightly, replaced by something that might have been cautious optimism. The other watchers remained in position, but their postures suggested decreased aggression, as if the transfer of the phone had satisfied some important requirement of their twisted justice system. The leader examined the phone briefly, turning it over in its hands with what appeared to be fascination. For people who considered it a magic box, the technology probably seemed as alien and incomprehensible as their beliefs seemed to us. "The bargain is acceptable," it said finally. "But bargains require enforcement. Promises must be bound with more than words." I felt a chill of apprehension as I realized that our negotiations were far from over. These people understood human nature well enough to know that promises made under duress might not be kept once the immediate threat had passed. They wanted some kind of guarantee that we would honor our agreement. "What kind of enforcement?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The leader reached into the folds of its robe and withdrew something that glinted in the light from our headlights. It was a small blade, perhaps 4 inches long, with symbols carved into the metal that matched those on the skull masks. The handle appeared to be made of bone, polished smooth by countless hands. "Blood oath," it said simply. "A binding that cannot be broken without consequences that extend beyond this life." The implications were terrifying. Not only did they want us to promise silence, they wanted us to participate in some kind of ritual that would create a supernatural enforcement mechanism for our agreement. The rational part of my mind rejected the possibility that such things could have any real power. But standing in that circle of skull-faced watchers, surrounded by evidence of their organizational capabilities and ruthless efficiency, I found my skepticism wavering. "What does that involve?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. "Each of you will contribute 3 drops of blood to the sacred earth," the leader explained. "The mountain will taste your essence and remember your promise. Should you violate the oath, the debt will be collected with interest compounded by betrayal." Tony spoke up from the truck bed, his voice strained but determined. "This is insane. We're not participating in any blood ritual with a bunch of lunatics." The leader's skull face turned toward Tony, and I saw several of the other watchers shift position in response to his defiance. The animals that had been pacing around our truck moved closer, their growls taking on a more aggressive tone. "The alternative," the leader said calmly, "is to collect the debt immediately and in full." The meaning was unmistakable. We could participate in their ritual and live, or refuse and die. There was no third option, no possibility of negotiation or compromise. They had reduced our situation to its most basic elements, compliance or death. I looked at my friends, seeing the same terrible understanding in their faces. Kevin was holding Heather tightly, both of them pale with terror but nodding slightly to indicate their acceptance of the terms. Brian had set down his axe, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Even Tony, despite his federal authority and his weapon, seemed to recognize that resistance would be futile. "All right," I said finally. "We accept your terms. But once this is done, once we've given blood and sworn your oath, you let us go immediately. No further conditions, no additional requirements." The leader nodded slowly. "The bargain is complete when the ritual is complete, not before." It gestured to the other watchers, who began to adjust their positions around our truck. Instead of maintaining their defensive circle, they formed 2 parallel lines that created a pathway leading from our vehicle toward the forest. The message was clear. We were to get out of the truck and follow them to wherever their ritual would take place. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, knowing that once I stepped out of the truck, we would be completely at their mercy. But the alternative, attempting to fight our way out against impossible odds, would certainly result in our deaths, and probably in ways far worse than whatever ritual they had planned. The door opened with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. I placed my feet on the rocky ground and stood up slowly, keeping my hands visible and making no sudden movements. Around us, the watchers observed every gesture with predatory attention, ready to respond to any sign of aggression or attempt at escape. One by one, my friends followed my example, climbing out of the truck with movements that spoke of barely controlled terror. Kevin helped Heather down from the passenger seat, while Brian and Tony emerged from the truck bed with their weapons reluctantly holstered. We stood together in a small group, surrounded by skull-faced figures and their animal companions, waiting for whatever came next. The leader pointed toward the pathway that had been created between the two rows of watchers. "Follow," it said simply. We began walking toward the forest, our footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the supernatural silence. The watchers fell into step around us, maintaining their formation while ensuring that escape remained impossible. Their animal companions padded alongside, close enough that I could smell their musky scent and hear the soft panting of their breath. As we disappeared into the darkness between the trees, I caught one last glimpse of my truck sitting abandoned beside the blocked road, its headlights still burning like the eyes of some mechanical beast. It occurred to me that we might never see it again, that this journey into the forest could be the beginning of a nightmare from which we would never wake. But we were still alive, and as long as we remained alive, there was hope. Even if that hope required us to participate in rituals that belonged in the darkest corners of human mythology. The march through the forest lasted nearly an hour, though time had become meaningless in that world of shadows and skull-faced guardians. They led us along paths that seemed to exist only for them, trails that wound between massive pine trees and over rocky outcroppings with a logic that spoke of decades of use. Every step took us deeper into wilderness that felt increasingly alien, as if we were leaving behind not just civilization, but the natural world itself. Our escort maintained perfect discipline throughout the journey. The watchers moved with silent efficiency, their positions adjusted constantly to ensure that escape remained impossible while never creating the impression of immediate threat. The animals paced alongside us, their presence a constant reminder that even if we somehow evaded our human captors, we would still face predators perfectly adapted to this environment. As we walked, I began to notice details about our surroundings that added layers of unease to an already nightmarish situation. Trees had been marked with symbols carved deep into their bark, the wounds old enough to have healed over but still visible as raised scars that caught the moonlight. Arranged stones created patterns that suggested meaning beyond random placement, geometric forms that hurt to look at directly and seemed to shift when observed peripherally. Most disturbing were the bones. They hung from branches at regular intervals along our path, suspended by lengths of sinew or leather cord that allowed them to turn slowly in the night breeze. Not all were from animals. Some had proportions and characteristics that suggested human origin, though I tried desperately to convince myself that my fear was distorting my perception. The bones had been decorated with painted symbols and wrapped with bundles of dried herbs that released disturbing fragrances as we passed beneath them. Heather stumbled at one point, her strength finally giving out under the accumulated stress of the night's events. Kevin caught her before she could fall, supporting her weight as she struggled to maintain consciousness. The leader observed this display of human weakness with what might have been interest, tilting its skull-crowned head as if cataloging our responses for some future reference. "Not much farther," it said, the first words spoken since we'd left the truck. The voice emerging from that bare skull mask carried tones of anticipation that made my skin crawl with fresh apprehension. We crested a small ridge and found ourselves looking down into a natural amphitheater formed by a circle of massive granite outcroppings. The space was perhaps 50 yards across, with a relatively flat floor that had been cleared of vegetation and covered with what appeared to be crushed bone and ash. At the center stood the structure I'd photographed 2 years earlier, though it had been significantly modified since our last visit. What had been a simple arrangement of stones was now a complex altar constructed from materials that reflected years of careful work. The base remained the original granite formation, but it had been expanded with additional stones that created a platform approximately 10 feet square. On top of this platform sat a structure that defied easy description, part shrine, part sculpture, part architectural impossibility. Skulls formed the primary decorative elements, hundreds of them arranged in intricate patterns that created the impression of faces within faces, eyes within eyes. They weren't all animal skulls. Scattered throughout the display were specimens that were unmistakably human, their empty sockets filled with crystalline formations that caught and reflected the moonlight in ways that suggested more than simple mineral deposits. Surrounding the altar were dozens of wooden poles, each one carved with symbols and topped with arrangements of bones, feathers, and other objects whose significance I could only guess at. Between the poles, rope or sinew had been strung to create a complex web that divided the amphitheater into sections, each one containing arrangements of stones, bones, and other ritual objects that followed patterns I couldn't comprehend. But it was the fire that commanded attention above all else. A massive bonfire burned at the far end of the amphitheater, its flames reaching toward the sky with an intensity that seemed unnatural. The wood feeding it had been arranged in geometric patterns that maintained their structure even as they burned, creating the impression of a fire that consumed without destroying, that burned according to rules that existed outside normal physics. The smoke rising from the fire was wrong in ways that made my eyes water and my throat burn. Instead of dispersing naturally in the night air, it formed complex spirals and geometric shapes that held their form far longer than any normal smoke should have been able to maintain. Colors flickered within the gray, deep purples, sickly greens, shades that had no names but triggered primitive responses in the parts of my brain responsible for recognizing danger. As we descended into the amphitheater, I became aware that we weren't the only ones present. Figures moved in the shadows around the perimeter, more watchers whose skull-masked faces turned toward us with predatory interest. I counted at least 20, possibly more hidden in the deeper shadows, bringing the total number of our captors to nearly 40. The organizational implications were staggering. This wasn't a small group of disturbed individuals. This was a functioning community that operated with the efficiency of a military unit and the cohesion of a religious order. They had infrastructure, resources, and clearly defined hierarchies that allowed them to coordinate complex operations across significant geographical areas. The leader guided us to a position near the altar, where we were surrounded by watchers arranged in concentric circles that created a natural amphitheater within the amphitheater. The positioning was clearly deliberate, designed to focus attention on whatever ceremony was about to unfold while ensuring that the participants had no possibility of escape. Kevin was supporting Heather, who seemed to be in a state of shock that bordered on catatonia. Brian and Tony flanked them, their hands empty but positioned to react quickly if the situation deteriorated further. I found myself in the center of our small group, the unwilling spokesperson for a negotiation that had moved far beyond anything I had experience handling. The leader stepped forward, positioning itself directly in front of the altar. In one hand it held Kevin's phone, in the other the bone-handled blade it had shown us earlier. The symbolism was unmistakable. Old magic confronting new technology, traditional justice dealing with modern transgression. "The bargain requires blood," it announced, its voice carrying clearly across the amphitheater despite the crackling of the massive fire. 3 drops from each transgressor, freely given to seal the oath of silence and protection. It gestured toward a shallow depression that had been carved into the surface of the altar, a bowl-shaped indentation that was stained dark with what I preferred not to identify. The sight of those stains made it clear that this ritual had been performed before, possibly many times, under circumstances I didn't want to imagine. "Who will offer blood first?" the leader asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge, each of us knowing that volunteering would demonstrate acceptance of their authority while refusing might provoke escalation to actual violence. I looked at my friends, seeing my own terror reflected in their faces, and made the decision that leadership sometimes requires. "I'll go first," I said, stepping forward before my courage could abandon me. The leader nodded approvingly and gestured for me to approach the altar. As I walked the few steps that separated me from the ritual platform, I became acutely aware of the dozens of skull faces turned in my direction, empty eye sockets that seemed to see more than living eyes ever could. The blade, when the leader offered it to me, was surprisingly warm to the touch. The metal had been heated by proximity to the fire, and the bone handle felt oddly comfortable in my grip, as if it had been designed specifically for my hand. The symbols carved into the blade seemed to shift and writhe in the firelight, creating optical illusions that made them appear to be moving independently of the metal that contained them. 3 drops only, the leader instructed. More would bind you to purposes beyond your understanding. I positioned the blade over the stained depression in the altar and made a quick, shallow cut across the palm of my left hand. The pain was sharp but brief, and the blood that welled up from the wound was darker than I expected, almost black in the strange light cast by the fire. The first drop fell into the depression with a soft sound that seemed to echo across the entire amphitheater. The second and third followed quickly, each one absorbed by the stained stone as if the altar itself was thirsty for human essence. The moment the third drop disappeared, I felt something change. Not physically. The cut on my palm was already beginning to clot. But something deeper, more fundamental. It was as if a connection had been established between myself and this place. A link that would persist regardless of time or distance. The leader took the blade from my hand and cleaned it carefully with a cloth that seemed to absorb the blood completely, leaving the metal pristine. "The first binding is complete," it announced. "Who offers next?" Kevin stepped forward without being asked, his jaw set with grim determination. He performed the ritual with the same quick efficiency I had used, his blood joining mine in the altar's depression. Heather followed, though she needed support to remain standing during the brief ceremony. Brian and Tony completed the ritual with obvious reluctance, but they understood that refusal at this point would invalidate our entire bargain. When the last drop of Tony's blood had been absorbed by the altar, the leader raised Kevin's phone above its skull-crowned head. "The device of transgression will be purified by sacred fire," it announced. "The images will be returned to the elements from which they came." It walked to the massive bonfire and, without ceremony, cast the phone into the flames. The device disappeared instantly, consumed by fire that burned with supernatural intensity. For just a moment, the flames seemed to flicker with different colors, and I could have sworn I saw images forming in the smoke. Faces, landscapes, memories being released from their digital prison and transformed into something else entirely. The destruction of the phone seemed to satisfy some requirement of their justice system. The watchers around the amphitheater began to relax their positions slightly, though they maintained their vigilance. The animals that had been pacing restlessly around the perimeter settled into resting positions, their role in the evening's events apparently complete. "The bargain is sealed," the leader announced, turning back to face us. "Blood has been offered, purification accomplished, debts balanced. You are bound by oath to protect the sacred places from further violation, to redirect others from paths that would lead to transgression, to speak of these events to no one." It paused, letting the weight of our obligations settle into our consciousness before continuing. "The consequences of oath-breaking extend beyond this life," it warned. "The mountain remembers, the forest remembers. The blood you have given will call out for justice should you betray the trust that has been placed in you." I wanted to ask what would happen to us now, whether we would be allowed to leave immediately, or if there were additional requirements we needed to fulfill. But before I could form the question, the leader was already providing the answer. "You will be escorted back to your vehicle," it said. "You will leave this place and not return. The sacred sites will be protected by your silence and your vigilance. This is the burden you have accepted in exchange for your lives." The escort back to our truck reversed the process that had brought us to the amphitheater, though the journey felt different now. We were no longer prisoners being led to judgment. We were participants in some ancient compact, bound by blood and oath to purposes we didn't fully understand but couldn't escape. When we finally emerged from the forest and saw my truck still sitting beside the blocked road, I felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost physically painful. The vehicle represented normalcy, civilization, a return to a world governed by physics and logic rather than blood oaths and skull-faced watchers. The roadblock had been cleared while we were gone. The vehicles that had blocked our escape moved aside to create a path to freedom. The leader gestured toward the open road with what might have been magnanimity, though it was impossible to read emotion in that bare skull mask. "Go," it said simply. "Remember your oath." We ran to the truck with desperate urgency, piling into the cab and bed with none of the order or dignity we'd maintained during our march through the forest. I started the engine on the first try and put the vehicle in gear without waiting for everyone to get settled properly. It gestured toward a shallow depression that had been carved into the surface of the altar, a bowl-shaped indentation that was stained dark with what I preferred not to identify. The sight of those stains made it clear that this ritual had been performed before, possibly many times, under circumstances I didn't want to imagine. "Who will offer blood first?" the leader asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge, each of us knowing that volunteering would demonstrate acceptance of their authority while refusing might provoke escalation to actual violence. I looked at my friends, seeing my own terror reflected in their faces, and made the decision that leadership sometimes requires. "I'll go first," I said, stepping forward before my courage could abandon me. The leader nodded approvingly and gestured for me to approach the altar. As I walked the few steps that separated me from the ritual platform, I became acutely aware of the dozens of skull faces turned in my direction, empty eye sockets that seemed to see more than living eyes ever could. The blade, when the leader offered it to me, was surprisingly warm to the touch. The metal had been heated by proximity to the fire, and the bone handle felt oddly comfortable in my grip, as if it had been designed specifically for my hand. The symbols carved into the blade seemed to shift and writhe in the firelight, creating optical illusions that made them appear to be moving independently of the metal that contained them. 3 drops only," the leader instructed. "More would bind you to purposes beyond your understanding." I positioned the blade over the stained depression in the altar and made a quick, shallow cut across the palm of my left hand. The pain was sharp but brief, and the blood that welled up from the wound was darker than I expected, almost black in the strange light cast by the fire. The first drop fell into the depression with a soft sound that seemed to echo across the entire amphitheater. The second and third followed quickly, each one absorbed by the stained stone as if the altar itself was thirsty for human essence. The moment the third drop disappeared, I felt something change. Not physically. The cut on my palm was already beginning to clot. But something deeper, more fundamental. It was as if a connection had been established between myself and this place. A link that would persist regardless of time or distance. The leader took the blade from my hand and cleaned it carefully with a cloth that seemed to absorb the blood completely, leaving the metal pristine. "The first binding is complete," it announced. "Who offers next?" Kevin stepped forward without being asked, his jaw set with grim determination. He performed the ritual with the same quick efficiency I had used, his blood joining mine in the altar's depression. Heather followed, though she needed support to remain standing during the brief ceremony. Brian and Tony completed the ritual with obvious reluctance, but they understood that refusal at this point would invalidate our entire bargain. When the last drop of Tony's blood had been absorbed by the altar, the leader raised Kevin's phone above its skull-crowned head. "The device of transgression will be purified by sacred fire," it announced. "The images will be returned to the elements from which they came." It walked to the massive bonfire and, without ceremony, cast the phone into the flames. The device disappeared instantly, consumed by fire that burned with supernatural intensity. For just a moment, the flames seemed to flicker with different colors, and I could have sworn I saw images forming in the smoke. Faces, landscapes, memories being released from their digital prison and transformed into something else entirely. The destruction of the phone seemed to satisfy some requirement of their justice system. The watchers around the amphitheater began to relax their positions slightly, though they maintained their vigilance. The animals that had been pacing restlessly around the perimeter settled into resting positions, their role in the evening's events apparently complete. "The bargain is sealed," the leader announced, turning back to face us. "Blood has been offered, purification accomplished, debts balanced. You are bound by oath to protect the sacred places from further violation, to redirect others from paths that would lead to transgression, to speak of these events to no one." It paused, letting the weight of our obligations settle into our consciousness before continuing. "The consequences of oath-breaking extend beyond this life," it warned. "The mountain remembers, the forest remembers. The blood you have given will call out for justice should you betray the trust that has been placed in you." I wanted to ask what would happen to us now, whether we would be allowed to leave immediately, or if there were additional requirements we needed to fulfill. But before I could form the question, the leader was already providing the answer. "You will be escorted back to your vehicle," it said. "You will leave this place and not return. The sacred sites will be protected by your silence and your vigilance. This is the burden you have accepted in exchange for your lives." The escort back to our truck reversed the process that had brought us to the amphitheater, though the journey felt different now. We were no longer prisoners being led to judgment. We were participants in some ancient compact, bound by blood and oath to purposes we didn't fully understand but couldn't escape. When we finally emerged from the forest and saw my truck still sitting beside the blocked road, I felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost physically painful. The vehicle represented normalcy, civilization, a return to a world governed by physics and logic rather than blood oaths and skull-faced watchers. The roadblock had been cleared while we were gone. The vehicles that had blocked our escape moved aside to create a path to freedom. The leader gestured toward the open road with what might have been magnanimity, though it was impossible to read emotion in that bear skull mask. "Go," it said simply. "Remember your oath." We ran to the truck with desperate urgency, piling into the cab and bed with none of the order or dignity we'd maintained during our march through the forest. I started the engine on the first try and put the vehicle in gear without waiting for everyone to get settled properly. As we drove away from that nightmare landscape, I caught one last glimpse in my rearview mirror of the leader standing alone beside the road, its skull-crowned head turned in our direction. Even at increasing distance, I could feel the weight of its attention, the reminder that we were bound now by something more powerful than law or conscience. We drove in absolute silence for the first 30 minutes, each of us lost in our own processing of what we'd experienced. When we finally reached an area with cell phone service, I pulled over and turned off the engine, needing to address what had happened before we returned to the normal world. "We never speak of this," I said, looking at each of my friends in turn. "Not to anyone, not under any circumstances. What happened tonight stays between us." They all nodded, understanding that our silence was enforced by more than simple agreement. We had given blood to seal our oath, participated in rituals that bound us to purposes beyond our comprehension. Whether the supernatural aspects of our binding had any real power was almost irrelevant. The psychological impact was complete and permanent. That was 3 years ago. I've never returned to those mountains, and neither have any of my friends. Kevin never replaced his phone, claiming he preferred the simplicity of a life less connected to digital networks. Heather left him 6 months later, unable to cope with the changes the experience had wrought in both of them. Brian moved to another state, citing job opportunities but really seeking distance from memories too terrible to confront. Tony requested a transfer to a different region, abandoning his career trajectory to escape the burden of knowledge he couldn't share. We've kept our oath of silence, though it's cost us more than I think any of us anticipated. The weight of shared secrets has a way of isolating people, creating barriers that prevent normal relationships from developing. We've become guardians of something we don't understand, protectors of sacred sites whose significance remains mysterious but whose power is undeniable. And sometimes, late at night when sleep refuses to come, I can still feel the connection that was forged in that amphitheater of bones and fire. The cut on my palm healed completely within a week, but something deeper remains. A link to places and purposes that exist outside normal human experience. I've written this account as a warning to others who might venture into those remote areas during the summer months. The mountains around Yellowstone hold secrets that are older and more dangerous than most people can imagine. There are watchers in the forest, guardians of traditions that predate European settlement by centuries or millennia. If you camp in remote areas, if you explore off the established trails, if you document your discoveries with cameras or phones, remember that you might be trespassing in sacred places protected by people who take their responsibilities very seriously. The debt they collect for violations might be paid in ways you can't imagine, binding you to purposes you don't understand with consequences that extend far beyond anything covered by normal law. Stay on the marked trails. Camp in designated areas. Don't photograph unusual rock formations or arrangements of objects that seem out of place in the natural environment. And if you ever find yourself surrounded by figures wearing skull masks in the middle of the night, remember that some bargains are enforced by powers older and more implacable than human justice. The mountain remembers, the forest remembers. And now, so do you.